equally as cringeworthy as what Corey does.
What can I say? I had a bad read on the relationship.
I mean, yeah, it's somewhat. I probably would say I have a roughly equal dislike for Chris and Corey, if I'm being honest. Like, they're both just terrible in their own ways.
I'm glad you haven't wrote Medium articles about me or anything.
Yeah, Travis dedicated an entire Bitcoin magazine article about you. That's right. Yeah, for those who don't know, while I was at Swan's conference, I wrote an article for Bitcoin magazine about the whole spread deal thing where they had 10% spreads.
Well, last year I tweeted out that I predicted their bankruptcy before Tether or USDC or Binance. Big guy. They're not bankrupt yet, Chris. They're just doing layoffs.
Credit where credit's due. See, that's the thing. I can separate ideas and concepts and people being right from my dislike of the person. Everyone here, or a lot of people here, could learn from that.
Jack, did you literally just reference George the guy like the
Yeah, no one else other than you can get over an argument.
What the hell was that?
Lieutenant Sewell a long time ago, right? I was just giving examples of prominent Democrats. I also mentioned Dan Goldman, prominent, Democrat from New York.
I just don't think George the guy was to be with that.
I think that you're all thinking about it a little too much. Like everybody who's in their camps or in their camps, everybody's paying attention is already in a camp, right? What is, especially by this point with 170 days left to go.
So what's going to happen with this supposed, $200 million VC fund that they may or may not have?
About the border or her reputation or whatever, but it's really not about that. My old professor, Dan, wrote a book called The Eyes of Democracy, and it was about people's personality in the days of showbiz and stuff, right? And the thing is that's really true. It's a big, for the independent voters who are not plugged in, it's a big popularity contest. And they're gonna look at her face, they're gonna look at the way she talks, right? And they're gonna say, how did I feel under her administration and how did I feel under their administration? It's gonna be a totally factless, gut feeling, instinctual thing. She sucks. And that's what the polls reflect. And I honestly don't think that and you were saying, what's your name, Trish or whatever, you were saying these attacks are weak right now. Of course these attacks are weak right now. We're going to save the good stuff for later in the month. You're not going to waste all your ammo right now. No, you're going to give her the final blow during the end, not for bad, not for gun, what do you call it?
Yeah, I mean, the commercials write themselves. You just put a chart up with inflation or illegal crossings at the southern border, and you just have her semi-transparent as the number hits record highs. This is not going to be a hard campaign.
Yeah, I'm telling my friends to use that one protocol. Get them right on that ad. But no, I just think that everybody, you're right, that Democrats are going to vote for her. They're not going to be, they're not going to waver. They're not going to waver because, they don't care that they were cheated or whatever, for all the reasons that you said. They're already entrenched in their side. They're not the people that are deciding the election, and I'm sure we all know this by now, and the people that are everyday people, not on Twitter like we all are, right? That's who's deciding the elections, and they don't care about the things that you think that they care about. They care about how does their pocketbook feel, what administration is it under, right? And what do these people look like and how do they make them feel? And, most of the people, you're right, voted for Trump, didn't vote for Biden because they like Biden. They voted because they hated Trump so much, but with a little sympathy from him being shot and with the change in the economy him actually, during the debates and all, pulling himself back and being a little more measured, he's a little more likable than he used to be. People don't loathe him as much as they did. I think that you're in for a big shock when these average people aren't motivated to the polls for Kamala Harris.
Well, we'll see, but the using her words against Biden is a little tricky because J.D. Vance has said horrible things in the past about Donald Trump, so you're just going to have dueling, ads like that. I'm not sure, once again, that that's going to particularly move things, okay? I think, look, Harris, I agree. I don't think she has the typical human reactions. She's off a little, right? And I think that's what you're talking about. So she'll laugh when it's not funny. Not the cackle. I mean, that's ridiculous. But, she doesn't seem...
She sounds like a hyena.
I'm sorry. The characterizations don't make any sense to me. I just think she...
I mean, she sort of looks like one, too.
Listen to you. You think this is going to attract women when you say all these horrible things about a woman because she's a woman?
I'm in a political
looks like
space.
Yeah,
I hope to God that's not my... Women will realize this.
What I'm trying to say is that I think that her reactions are not quite right, and that will factor in. So the question is whether she can somehow redefine herself a little bit differently or better during the next couple of weeks. I don't know that she can. I've already said I think Trump's going to win, but she has a chance here, and I don't know if she... I think, let me just put it to you like this. The last day or so, she behaved really well. The last week, she didn't push it too much, but yesterday she was on phone 10, 12 hours. Now it's $81 million, blah, blah, blah. All the big donors are coming back. So, she hasn't done, the past couple of week or so, she's been pretty good. I don't know that she can get over the fact that she does fundamentally not come across as super likable to many people. But I also, let me just say one more thing. If you think that Donald Trump, look, in the debate with Joe Biden, he didn't have to do anything, did he? Because Joe Biden just completely collapsed. Nightmare, disaster. Trump was not...
That's not what Harry Sisson said. Harry Sisson said...
I don't care what Harry said. It was horrible. And after 5 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, I'm texting people, this is awful, unbelievable. Disaster was, I think, the word I used several times. And most people saw that. Donald Trump didn't have to do anything, so he was just doing his usual, all the immigrants coming in, they're taking the jobs, he did his usual whatever. He's going to have to actually go against her, and his record with going against women, well, at least Hillary Clinton, was not stellar, and I'm not convinced that he's going to come across as super likable in the next debate. Once again, he's in the driver's seat now. I don't think she can pull it off, but I do think there's been a jolt here, and things are a little different than they were last week.
Sarah, can I ask you a quick question? This is like an honest to God question. When I watched the debate, you just said, were you surprised at Biden's performance during the debate? Were you surprised? Did it shock?
Yes. Let me tell you what most...
Why? I was telling you for years ago.
Look, I saw him in the State of the Union 2 years ago. He was he's always made that. Okay, he's old. Okay, he walks slowly because he's worried about falling in his neuropathy. None of those things really bothered me. 2 years ago, the State of the Union, he was bantering back and forth. Remember, he was pretty damn good. Okay, this past February, he was okay. He was fine. He was reading a teleprompter, granted, but he had some sides, and they weren't bad. I actually believe, like most Democrats, that quite frankly, the Republicans, all of it, they cut the clips and they wouldn't show who he was talking, all that stuff. You didn't do yourself you didn't help yourself, right? Because you made it seem, these clips that showed up were sometimes deceptively edited, let's just say. So I thought, yes, he's slowing down. Yes, he might have the beginnings of something, but, he'll manage. When I saw that debate, I said, and you know what hit me about that debate? It wasn't even, the debate was awful, but when they said he didn't see a doctor afterwards. And I said to myself, if that had happened to a relative of mine, they'd be out with the doctor like in the next minute, right? Because if anybody saw a relative like this, you'd be like, oh my God, what the hell happened there?
I just want to tell you my perspective.
So you think he should step down from the presidency?
I just want to tell you my perspective, and I see what you're saying, right? But my perspective was, I watched that debate and I go, the whole thing, and before I looked at Twitter, and I'm like, man, he's not doing that bad. I expected him to do worse, right? Like, I literally expected him to do worse. And I was watching it like, well, he's not doing that bad. I was surprised, not at his performance, I was surprised at everybody's reaction to his performance being, oh, so terrible, because that was a performance I believe I've seen the entire time, and not from clips, because I actually turned C-SPAN on and watch it, right? Like, I was surprised at everyone's reaction. So I just don't know, in my heart of hearts, like, I don't understand how Democrats can't feel lied to, because I didn't think he did that bad. I thought he had a couple weird facial expressions.
Because they're not running on the truth.
No, but that's,
Lisa, they're not running on the truth or policy. They're running on, we hate America and white. That doesn't
But what
change
Lisa
based
just
on the
said
case.
is really interesting. We have two different perspectives. Clearly, my view was he was nowhere near as bad as Republicans were suggesting, and I saw this and said, oh my gosh, there's something really wrong here. Now, I still don't know what this is. People have, I'm not a doctor, okay, and I think all this armchair.
But it never bothered you when he entered the press room that he couldn't walk down the
No,
corridor
you know why?
that Trump,
You know why?
Obama,
Because I
Bush.
saw
I
a
mean,
lot
there's
of
an
times he's
indication
being
from day
told
one.
which way to go because he asked the question. Also, look, he was clearly getting
It was
older.
also
The
being
slowness.
questions by the media. That wasn't weird to you? I've never seen that before. Where the media and the president have note cards, and he has their name on it. He's calling it each. Every press conference, the questions and answers were pre-planned. The debate, they weren't. I mean, the questions were, but his reaction was. He hasn't been in this situation. They've been protecting
I
him.
don't agree with that. I think he asked for the people in order, but I don't think he, certainly not in the last press conference after the debate of that 50 minutes, when actually, surprisingly enough, he had a lot of substance in many of his answers, but he made the two bloopers, and nobody's going to forgive him for that anymore. In the past, they might have. If he had a good debate, I think that press conference would have been good, fine. But because of the fact that you clearly saw something, it doesn't really matter anymore. And that's why I said.
Sarah, do you concede at least that the media's focus and narrative about Biden shifted? Like, you now understand why Trump's like that's just a fraction of what Trump had to deal with about distortions and what. Except in this instance, it was true. But at least here, do you see how when they decided to dump him, how fast that narrative switched by the media?
Once again, I don't know what people saw. I have 3 doctors in my family, and nobody's making diagnoses on TV or anything like that. But, they all said to me I guess I won't even say it. They all had the same diagnosis, which I thought was interesting because it wasn't a diagnosis that would have always come up. And they all said, but stress, but a cold, but tired. All these things would make this worse, right? So I don't know what people have seen, okay? I really don't. I don't know if he's been, they see him from 10 to 4, he's been sort of okay, and later in the evening, I don't know. What I know is what I've seen, and also I see deceptively edited things by Republicans, and I didn't believe it. Now I believe that something has happened. Now, do I think he's keeling over, and should he resign? I think it would have been better for her if he did, but he's not saying that he's resigning because of it, or he's not saying that he's leaving because of this medical issue. And at the end of the day, what doctors in my family suggested to me is he can definitely do the job.
But he did
for
say,
a few months.
real quick, just to clarify your words, he did say that the only reason he would step down if it was medical,
high standards.
right, is if it was medical or his doctors told him to, and then a day later we get the resignation. So,
yeah, and you know what? Big surprise, people in politics are pressured and they say one thing and they do another. Is that unusual? I mean, I figure the pressure, the unrelenting people coming out and saying, I'm not going to vote, President Biden step down, got to him, and then clearly he was only going to listen to a couple of people, right? He only has a couple of advisors.
Threatened him. That's what I think.
What?
I think Nancy Pelosi threatened him, and because she said we can do it the nice way or we can do it the hard way. I think she threatened him, and I think that he's literally afraid. That's what I think. Because
what was the hard way?
You think that funding all came at once? They made it disappear for Biden. Like, Obama has significant sway over a lot of the Hollywood, a lot of big donors. You think Kamala within a day? No. As soon as they got what they wanted and Biden resigned, donors start. Like, the pressure campaign. Listen, you can argue about technical, legal as much as you want to. We've had these discussions before. But is it ethical? I don't know. I mean, this seems like a backroom deal.
To put a pressure deal on a president you think is going to lose, why not?
Listen, you see the consolidation around Kamala now, and they have to do that because in reality, and you're right about this, is the convention will be a clusterfuck if it's open. If you're going to challenge Kamala, who has no daylight in her policies from her and Biden, right, you're going to have a different platform, different policies. So you can't really elect somebody outside of the ticket and not fundamentally alter that if people are really going to have a challenge. Like, this to me is it's backroom dealing at the highest levels, and it's rich people and party elites and lobbyists who are controlling
Can I
Biden
ask you
stepping
something,
down
Prodigal?
and Kamala being
Let me ask you
anointed.
something. If Joe Biden had had a good debate, okay, and by good debate I mean sort of State of the Union-y or like the press conference, off a little, made a couple of mistakes, but it was, not frozen face, not blinking and looking weird. If he had a good debate, do you think all of this would have happened?
I don't think so. I honestly think he might have done better at the second debate. That's why I'm looking at it. I still think Biden might be their best chance to win. I understand what you're saying about it stops the bleeding. At least now you're at least level again. You're at the status quo, and maybe you can rise. I just don't think
On
Kamala
my
has a better
sources, like I
chance
said
of
earlier, they told me, the ones that are very close to him on his campaign, actually chief of staff level, okay, basically, they're saying that this was a setup by his own team and that they wanted him to perform poorly at the debate and they set it all in motion from then. Like, that's literally what they told me.
So Lisa, you're saying, what did his team do? Poison him? Give him
No, they said it was
drowsy
his
soup
speechwriter.
and said not drowsy? What'd they do?
It was his speechwriter, how they prepared him. They set him up
They can't set him up. They cannot set him up if his polling is good. The reality of the matter is they hit him in the basement for 2020, and the Democrats have made it policy now, especially against nationalist, populist, MAGA candidates, either not to debate like Katie Hobbs in Arizona or wait to the last minute like they did with Oz in Pennsylvania. The truth is Biden's trajectory was so bad, they had no choice but to take the debate to try to shake it up. He would have never taken a debate this early if the polling wasn't that bad. He probably would have never taken a debate at all.
The guy's name
And that's reality
the
now.
guy's name was John, I think, that was the speechwriter that they're saying was helping orchestrate this. Like,
Hey, listen to this, Lisa, and what do you, and I'm not, you guys are going to say I'm crazy, but this morning Charlie Kirk reported that people were saying that Biden was sick, right? He drops out of the race unexpectedly. The last time we've seen him, he tweets, literally, I'm sick, and then somebody posts underneath that a fundraising link, but it was an odd tweet. The last time we see him, he's walking very slow. Nobody has seen him or heard from him since. He drops out of the campaign on Twitter via a letter. Next thing we know, there's all these rumors, including from his brother, saying that he's sick. And now, apparently, Kamala Harris is on her way to Delaware for whatever reason.
So is Hunter. Hunter just touched down.
And Hunter's there too. Guys, this isn't...
At the very least, he's not healthy enough.
What I'm telling you is, something is up, and let me tell you what I think is up. I'm making a prediction, okay? Think about this. Trump has all the momentum right now because he was almost assassinated. People feel bad for him, right? The only thing that trumps an assassination is if the current president gets very sick and you watch his decline throughout the entire campaign, and then his vice president rises up to the challenge and leads the country through these dark days. Something is up here, and I see the narrative being built right in front of our eyes, and if we're paying attention, this sounds suspiciously like Kamala Harris is going to be president, possibly before the end of the day. And
so what are you going to say? They're going to blame the Trump debate?
No, they're not going to blame Trump on anything.
David, do you think Joe Biden is in on this? Is that your supposition?
I'm not saying anybody's in on anything.
He would have to be.
could be in on. He's getting.
Well, Jill and Hunter may have no choices.
Right, what I'm saying is, Tara, he might actually be sick, and whatever they've been doing to kind of keep him going, they've stopped doing, and now he's actually sick. And as a result, he's no longer able to continue as president, which means Kamala Harris would have to serve. The benefit to the Democratic Party, if we're looking at it from a political perspective, is her serving as president in the months before the election gives her real-life experience and allows her to run as the de facto incumbent, which is different than the step-in when if Biden serves out the rest of his term.
But why wouldn't
And
he
they don't
just
need to
resign?
Fifth Amendment.
Why wouldn't he just resign?
They have to be careful about it.
He's going to resign,
No,
Tara.
but what
This
I'm
is what I'm
saying, he
saying.
could have resigned on Sunday and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm very
That's not
sick."
Joe Biden style. Come on, Terry.
No, I think he's
Because his family would do. Joe Biden would never allow that. These are power-hungry people. This is being done. This is like a coup on your side, on the Dem side, to get these people out behind.
So you're
Joe
saying
Biden
that
doesn't
where
want
is
out.
Jill
Hunter
Biden?
Biden
Is he
doesn't
locked
want
in a
out.
basement?
Joe Biden doesn't want out.
Where is Jill Biden then?
Joe Biden's getting
They've been
railroaded.
protecting him a long time, but they can't withstand Clyburn,
Correct.
Pelosi, Durbin, Schumer. Eventually, when these guys speak and say, we're coalescing against you, too bad. Who cares what Jill says? Because these people all have blackmailed each other, but they all have more on Biden than Biden has on them.
Wait, Zach, so are you saying this
You
is
really just can't strong arm at this
this
point.
is a Saddam situation? We're back
It's
to
basically,
the
yeah.
1979 Saddam coup is going on right now.
It's basically a soft coup where they've gone in and said, you don't want funding, you don't want secrets to get out, you don't want embarrassment. Okay, then you need to go away quietly, or else we're going to make this a humiliation.
And they
And the
planned
Biden family just
right
doesn't
now,
want
and
that.
they got together and planned who was going to be where before they make this announcement. Man, this is typical of what they would do. And listen, you're asking where Jill Biden is. Her husband is dying. She's been told, shut your mouth. You have no power. You're going to get a good pension. We're going to give him the funeral he wants. Keep your mouth shut and let us do this. She knows.
Honestly, I really think
The job is
it's
killing him.
amazing
The
how
job
you
is
can
killing
make up so much stuff out of so little.
What do you think
Right
they
now,
did to Nancy
Kamala
Reagan?
Harris
Here's the
Kara,
thing, Kara.
the job, the stresses of the job are killing
At
Well-
some point, you have to look at all of the little hints they're giving us, right? And the fact that Joe Biden's deterioration has been evident to literally everyone on this planet for the past 4 years prior to him being elected, the fact that it's been hidden clearly indicates that there are people in positions of power that are aware that he is not well, and they have hidden that. And they have done so because other people like Jill Biden have the ability to put them in their place. And at some point, when you are in a position where you lose your leverage, the tables turn, right? And so what we're seeing is all of that play out. All of these people have worked together for decades. Decades. You know how much dirt I have on people that I've known my entire life? I wouldn't snitch on them, but these people will. There are no loyalties when it comes to politics. One day you're their friend, the next day you are being absolutely obliterated by their narrative. So I would not be surprised at all if the powers that be were like, look, the poll numbers suck. You're clearly not in good health. We're done. We're pulling the plug on this. And if you don't go along with it, everything's coming out. And it's in Joe Biden's best interest to play along with it. They're all complicit in elder abuse. Is very evident. It will never be charged. Nothing will come from that. But to say this is some sort of stretch, that there's an internal coup going on, that's not a stretch in my opinion. It wouldn't
But
surprise me in the least.
listen, definitely, everything that, and hi, it's nice to talk to you. Everything that you've said, I agree, there's been enormous pressure on Biden when it was viewed that the polling was going downhill, the debate was a disaster, and people have been doing everything they can to get him to step out. That is not a secret. That's been going on publicly, okay? But when you're taking it to he's dying and they're hiding it, or I don't even understand the nature of this,
They
right?
did that to Reagan, man. They made Nancy shut her mouth when they knew he had dementia. This is not new.
But what I'm trying to say is, what is the purpose? He's already dropped out of the race.
To give
Because
Kamala
it's
her
a national security
experience.
issue. If Joe Biden is sick or resigning, they would have to have the entire apparatus in place before announcing it publicly because it's a national security risk. So all of the things, the movements you're seeing and the reports that you're starting to see suggests that something is up. I mean, look, this all could be just a blown out conspiracy, but the fact that Kamala Harris is literally getting on an airplane right now and Joe Biden isn't in Washington, D.C., the fact that his son is in Delaware, and the fact that you haven't seen the president in 5 days and he just resigned from his campaign, something is up. Now, Tara, I don't know what is up.
David,
Something is
also,
up.
he turned away a meeting with Netanyahu.
He
Who
resigned
came
from
to
his
see him.
campaign via Twitter.
Well, that was supposed to happen.
Right, he turned it away.
No. He was supposed to turn it. He had turned it away before all of this happened. He had said, "I'm not meeting with you because Bibi had insulted him." I think there was.
I don't care about that. I'm saying he resigned via Twitter, guys. I mean, you usually address the nation. You usually make some type of, public speech about the.
He can't. He is too frail, and his voice sounds too bad, and he's too weak. No amount of makeup can alter that illusion now. So I mean, but they have to be careful with the transition of power, and the less anyone knows, the better in their estimation.
Right, because his
so it's
doctor
going to
said
be
he was getting
it's going to be
better.
a long week. They're going to reveal as little as they have to. Legally speaking, I don't think they have to reveal anything as long as Biden is alive and can sign papers. Like, hey, Like think of it as the old kings of Europe when they had a power sharing struggle or transition issue. As long as you control the corpse, you still have the upper
All right,
hand.
breaking.
And I think that's an issue,
on the
though,
issue.
too. Someone mentioned that if he's not, cognitive enough to be signing paperwork, how long has that been an issue, and what has he signed as president into law that he had no understanding of? So also
Breaking.
something to keep in mind.
It just came out, guys. Sorry to interrupt. It just came out. President Biden completed his 10th rounds of Laxavid. I hope I probably murdered that one.
Paxlovid.
That's what I said. Paxlovid. That's what I said. Yeah.
Oh, Paxlovid, not Plax.
It doesn't even
Yeah,
work.
whatever.
It gives you a rebound, so it's really silly.
His symptoms have almost resolved completely. His pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and temperature remain absolutely normal. His oxygen saturation continues to be excellent. On room air, his lungs remain clear. The president continues to perform all his presidential duties. I will continue to keep your office update with any changes in his condition or treatment plan. Respectfully, physician for president.
I'm rooting for a comeback. I hope he rescinds his resignation and goes at Kamala. I want chaos. I want turmoil.
Well, that's the Chuck Johnson route, isn't it?
Hook this guy up with some testosterone, some Adderall, give him some boosters, and just let him loose.
Okay, I'm going to post that up in the space.
So
guys.
one of the most amusing things about this is all the people on your side, Prodigal, think that somehow dementia, Alzheimer's can be cured by testosterone and Adderall. If that were the case, we should
I
be
didn't
giving
say
it to
that.
the seniors in the country. What are you talking about?
I was talking about the COVID. I want him back.
Oh,
on
I
the
thought
trip.
you were talking
No, but my grandmother had dementia, and my family's all medical except for me. Okay, but my grandma did have dementia, and when she had a higher cups of coffee in the morning, she was more lucid. Right? There were days where she would be totally fine, and then she was like, "This lady in my room stealing my underwear." It was like her reflection taking her underwear out of her drawer in the mirror. Okay, right? So, but there were days where if she had a good meal and she had a good, and she had a couple cups of coffee, she was way better than others. And so, no, it doesn't cure it, but you can definitely prop somebody up and get their neurons firing a little more effectively via certain, enhancements than,
I'm really sorry.
than otherwise. I mean, I lived it for
Sorry,
7
Lisa,
years.
I'm sorry about your relative. I'm very sorry to hear that. But I also think, knowing people with Alzheimer's, that it only works in beginning stages, maybe a little bit, and it's not like testosterone or Adderall or anything like that. And then
Have you taken testosterone and Adderall? That's what we want to know, Tara. How
no,
would you
I
know?
have not.
You got nothing. You got nothing.
On
Have
the
you
other
ever
hand, I
tried
don't
Shrek?
think as far as I know. I mean, I understand you think I'm left-wing demented, but that's a little different.
I'm just teasing you. I know how far left wing you are.
Yeah,
You didn't fall off the edge. You still have half your brain.
I mean, he didn't look at death's door. That's why, I'm going to wait. I sort of agree with Sarah here. Let's listen. For them, I think it's more convenient, sadly, if he does, pass away, because at that point, all the questions about his cognitive abilities during his presidency, whether they engaged in a conspiracy to cover this up, go away. So, I mean, to me, he didn't look on death's door. So I hope he's okay. Plus, to be honest with you, I don't think he's going unless he issues a mass pardon for his brother James, for his son Hunter, for everybody in his family who was involved in their foreign influence peddling scheme. I think, if Kamala's going to, either way, whether Kamala wins or loses or Biden, sadly passes away, I think we'll see him issue a pardon.
I would agree. That would be the signal if we see a pardon, for sure. Okay, so I stepped back for a second. Tara, I wanted to revisit what it is about the Democrat Party and your dislike for President Trump's platform. Or is it just the personality? I'm not picking on you. I just want to know, is it the personality that just drives you away? Because I'm trying to draw up this conclusion, which it's not one size fits all. I understand that the left is more concerned with virtue, is where the right is more concerned with values. I kind of lean it towards that to be a true statement, but I still want to hear what you have to say and what motivates you, at the ballot box.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, obviously, I find Trump's personality. I live in New York. I've known about Trump for years. I have friends who've met him. He's not like a nice human being. I understand people here love him. I'm not saying that. He's not charitable. He's never done anything for other people particularly. Everybody in New York, you get in the boards of things, you donate to the Metropolitan Opera. He has never done really any of those
What about
things.
the ice skating rink in the middle of the...
Yeah. But, there's Woman Ring.
Yeah, but the
that was a
Clintons did
concept.
charity in
I'm
Haiti.
just
What about the
That's
family
what the charity didn't go.
I don't have to
family
find
shot who lived in his building forever?
I don't happen to find him personally admirable, but that's not really a political issue. But
Yeah, because you're an anti-Semite. You don't like that his grandchildren are
I'm Jewish. Why would I not like that his grandchildren
Okay,
are
all right.
Jewish?
Well, let's get on
Jesus.
track. Let's get
Father,
back on
let's
track
go
here,
on.
guys.
But you said he wasn't charitable.
Oh my God!
Wow.
Saying someone's not charitable to Jew? That's come on, enough.
Actually, the best business I've done, hey, for the
You
record.
moved the goalpost from saying he wasn't charitable to he wasn't admirable.
So, for the
I
record,
don't
the
find
best
that
business I've ever
admirable.
done is
What
with
do you-
Jews, to be honest with you.
Can we just stop?
All right,
okay,
go ahead.
I'm not doing the Jewish thing. Okay, now in Trump, I fundamentally think that Trump has I call it puffery, but it's more than that. It's he lies as easily as he breathes. So, for example, Obama left him with a perfectly good economy.
As easily as mine.
He did not. You're asking me what I think about Trump, right? He basically did not make the economy great. He was left with a good economy. He continued it to a certain extent, but
So why did Obama say the
he
new
did
normal
not
for
actually
GSP
do
was
that. But I don't
1.5
like
to
his
2%
tax
growth?
plan. I don't think it helped the company. It was a little.
Yeah, because
It
we're in
was
high
a
tax
sugar-
states. The salt tax killed
You're
them. The
asking,
salt
you're
tax
not.
killed them.
Either you want to know or you don't.
Yeah, no, I want
Don't
to hear it, because
Okay,
give
so
me
I
2
think-
points.
I
Give me
think-
2 points, because everyone's going to keep jumping down your
All
throat.
right.
2
Like
points.
I said, I don't think his policies were amazing. Okay, I think they were fine in many respects, but they were nothing like he said they were. And I think he took credit for things that were nothing to do with him. If gas prices went down, it's Donald Trump. They go up, it's Democrats. I mean, everything like that bothers me. But the main thing to me was he fomented distrust in our democracy in a way that was unnecessary and wrong. Now, you all think probably the election was stolen. I don't think it was, and I think he spent months ginning that up. Okay, basically saying if I lose, it's because it's stolen. He's been
Okay.
doing it
All
now.
right, Tara,
And
okay.
to me, that's a problem. Okay, it's a huge problem.
Right.
I'll say one thing. Can
Go
I
ahead.
just say one more thing?
Go ahead.
His remarks about Taiwan, his stance on NATO, I don't like. Okay, Taiwan, that was terrible. We need Taiwan right now. Okay, they're still making most of our chips. If China takes over Taiwan, we are totally screwed. Who the hell says things like I'm not going to necessarily defend them?
Tara, okay, so let me ask you a question real
He's
quick.
trying to relocate
Let me ask,
here.
yeah, hold on one second. Let me just get a couple more questions. Terry, you're an attorney, right?
I'm retired, but yes, I'm an attorney.
You were, okay, so I would assume that you have some negotiations training. I've been self-employed for 25 years. Sometimes it takes a hard line. There's different tactics, right? As somebody that has had to negotiate, don't you see what's happening? Because I do, from my vantage point, as somebody that's had to negotiate contracts and whatnot through the years. And I had a pretty decent sized dump truck company in my 20s, and I got into digital marketing, and I deal with, decent sized businesses. So I understand sometimes having to draw a hard line. Sometimes you got to be a sweetheart. It just depends on the people you're dealing and what's at stake, right? Don't you see it? Because I think a lot of America understands why he is the way he is. And I would say, as somebody who's endorsed Trump, who jumped into politics thinking Trump needed an ally as well, that was one of the reasons here. I was never going to allow his ego to persuade my voting, just to be clear, by the way, because we're all conscious of that as well. But we all kind of understand what's going on here, and it's like, is the left so emotionally in tune? It's not a dig, to where it foggies the vision. And the other thing I'd like to say here, and I'll land it here, is that has the media done such a great job of producing prejudice that this guy can't even get a benefit of the doubt out of the left anymore? Your take.
Like I said, I think fomenting the sort of distrust he did for solely, his own selfish purposes in our electoral system is beyond the pale. Nobody's done that before. People have made some comments, but not like him. I'm not going to go to January 6th. I don't, it's not, whatever. But I think he did these things deliberately, and he's still doing them.
He was right.
But don't you think we had to peel back the layer a little bit, because we're too little
You know what?
suspicious?
We have a 50-state electoral system that is arcane in many respects. There are different rules. Everybody knew counting wouldn't be done the night of. To sort of say, oh, they stopped counting and then they started, this is all nonsense and everybody
It wasn't just that.
But Tara,
Karen.
don't you think everyone got more educated in the process, though? Good,
No,
bad, and
I
different?
think he made, like, say, 50% or 70% of Republicans who think the election was stolen. I think he snookered them. He's good at that.
Question.
He snookered them. Let me
Hold on,
just finish.
she's finishing the last
Okay.
one.
Now, let me just finish. I also believe that a lot of what he did, I used the North Korea thing. Okay, that was just ridiculous. Did you read the 4-sentence agreement that he came up with King George? He elevated this person on the stage of the world stage. He made him seem like he was the biggest threat in the world to everybody. And then he had a 4-line, it was literally 4-sentence agreement that literally did nothing, did not require him to get rid of his nuclear program or anything. Just said, I'll commit to looking into it. This was crazy, and he did a lot of these things that were not, they
It's a
sound
start.
like, at the end of
It's
the
a
day,
starting
they were not.
point.
It was about opening
It was opening dialogue.
It was about
Yeah.
dialogue.
I don't think so. I
Yes.
think he was just trying to pump himself
Yeah, it
up.
was. We had to do it.
He did.
As opposed to Biden, where now they've shut down their nuclear reactor, they take more enriched uranium, they're dropping shit balloons on South Korea. They are now entering into stronger bilateral alliances with Russia, supplying them with artillery, now sending troops to Ukraine. So your argument is that Biden's foreign policy with North Korea is better than Trump's. Am I understanding that correctly?
Trump made up things to make himself look good without actually doing
I think that was,
Sorry.
Tara, I believe you that that's your argument, because I think that the left did an incredible job of cultivating prejudice towards the man. That's what I think, because believe me, there were times where I sat back and heard him speak in the outtakes, and I was like, Jesus, dude. But then I went back and I watched it for myself in context, and boy, it was very, very different than what the left had crafted their, 3-minute blurb into.
Let me also say that I fundamentally, and this is a viewpoint that is not held by most Republicans anymore. It used to be, but it no longer is. I believe in NATO. I think there are reasons we enter into alliances. I think these reasons were not only valid back when the Soviet Union was dissolving and things like that, but they are valid now. I think the United States is not necessarily stronger by saying things like, we're just going to do everything on our own. I think we need allies and we need alliances. So I don't have a problem.
I would agree with that statement.
And so, to me, this concept that, why don't we just spend it all in America? We're not gonna. Okay, we never have.
I know,
You
but
tell me
it
the last
starts a
time we had-
conversation, though, doesn't it, with them not
No,
paying?
it doesn't, because most of the people who support Donald Trump somehow think he convinced NATO to pay millions and millions and billions of dollars into like a treasury or something like that. There was an agreement, and I think it was Latvia in 2014, and then it was updated about 2021 by the NATO countries that said that they will try and contribute 2% of their GDP to their own defense spending. Right?
Good, because
Now-
we didn't have to pay it, and our kids don't have to pay it. My kids
But
don't have to
that's
pay
not
it.
a pity that we get, okay? The United States still is always, and the only person who's ever invoked Article 5 is the United States, and to basically diss NATO constantly, I just don't agree with that. I just
I have
don't
a
agree
question
with
for
it.
you. Wait, real quick. You said that Trump was the one that fomenting all the distrust in our government and our electoral system, right? Do you think that when the Democrats or the poll counters, okay, in Philadelphia, which is 95% Democrat, do you think that when they started boarding up the windows while they were counting the ballots, would you say that foments distrust in the electoral system?
That case was litigated, if I remember correctly. and
I'm not asking that. I'm not asking if it was litigated.
What I'm saying
putting forth stuff. You're not listening.
It pierces God to the marrow, that the soul of his God flow out, whether a snake.
The Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar. Translated by Rex Warner. Book 1. 58 BC. Descriptions of Gaul. First operations against the Helvetii. separate parts, one of which is inhabited by the Belgi, one by the Aquitani, and one by the people whom we call Gauls, but who are known in their own language as Celts. These three peoples differ from one another in language, customs, and laws. The river Garonne forms the frontier between the Gauls and the Aquitani, the rivers Seine and Marne between the Gauls and the Belgi. The toughest soldiers come from the Belgi. This is because they are farthest away from the culture and civilized way of life of the Roman province. Merchants, bringing the influences which tend to make people effeminate, hardly ever go into those parts, and they are also nearest to the Germans across the Rhine, and are continually waging war with them. For the same reason, the Helvetii are the bravest tribe among the Gauls. They too are in almost daily contact with the Germans, either fighting to keep them out of Gaul or launching attacks on them in their own territory. That part of the country which, as I have said, is occupied by the Gauls starts from the Rhone and is bounded by the Garonne, the ocean, and the country of the Belgi. On the side where the Sequani and Helvetii live, it extends up to the Rhine. It may be said to face north. The country of the Belgi, beginning at the Gallic frontier, extends as far as the lower Rhine and faces northeast. Aquitania starts at the Garonne and extends up to the Pyrenees and the ocean west of Spain. It faces northwest. Among the Helvetii at this time, much the richest and most distinguished man was a certain Orgetorix. This man aimed at making himself king over his tribe, and during the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, organized a conspiracy among the nobility and persuaded the people to migrate from their territory in full force. It would be perfectly easy, he said, since they were the bravest of the Gauls, for them to conquer the whole country. His arguments were all the more persuasive because the Helvetii were in fact shut in on every side by natural geographical boundaries. On one frontier there was the broad and deep stream of the Rhine, separating them from Germany. On another, the high range of the Jura Mountains separated them from the Sequani, while between them and the Roman province, on their third frontier, lay the Lake of Geneva and the Rhone. In these conditions, their range of movement was restricted, and it was not easy for them to fight campaigns against their neighbors. This they greatly resented, since they were naturally fond of war, and they considered that their territory, measuring 227 by 170 miles, was too small for a people like themselves, so populous and with so lofty a military reputation. These considerations and the great influence of Orgetorix made the Helvetii decide to prepare all the necessary arrangements for a mass migration. They were to buy up all the wagons and pack animals that they could, sow as much grain as possible so as to have adequate supplies on the march, and make treaties of friendship with neighboring states. Reckoning that they would need 2 years for effecting all this, they passed a law binding them to set out in the 3rd year. Orgetorix was appointed to deal with these preparations, and he set out in person on a conciliatory mission to the neighboring states. While on this mission, he urged the Sequanian Casticus, whose father, Cartamanteloides, had for many years been a king of the Sequani, and had been given by the Senate the title of Friend of the Roman People, to usurp the royal power which his father had previously held. He also encouraged Domnarix, the Aeduan, brother of Diviciacus, who, with the support of the great mass of the people, held the chieftainship at this time, to make a similar attempt at seizing royal power, and gave him his daughter in marriage. He assured both that there would be no difficulty in what he was suggesting. He himself, he said, would soon seize supreme power in his own state. There was no doubt that the Helvetii were the most powerful people in Gaul, and he promised them that he would use his own army and his own resources to make them safe in their kingdoms. These arguments of Orgetorix proved effective. Promises were exchanged and confirmed by oath, and it was confidently expected that once they had seized the kingship of these three powerful and valiant nations, they would make themselves masters of the whole of Gaul. The conspiracy, however, was reported to the Helvetii by an informer, and Orgetorix was told that, according to tribal custom, he must stand his trial in chains. If found guilty, the legal penalty was death by burning. On the day fixed for the trial, Orgetorix brought with him to the place of judgment all 10,000 of his retainers, together with a great many other tribesmen who owed him money or were bound to him in some way or other. With their aid, he avoided the necessity of having to stand trial. The people as a whole, however, were angry at this evasion of justice. They determined to assert their rights by force of arms, and the magistrates were already mobilizing large bodies of men from various parts of the country when Orgetorix was found dead. It was strongly suspected among the Helvetii that he had taken his own life. The death of Orgetorix, however, made no difference to the determination of the Helvetii to carry out their plans for the migration. When finally they considered that all their preparations were complete, they set fire to their fortified towns. There were 12 of these, 400 villages, and all private dwelling houses. They burned all their grain except that which they planned to carry with them, so that with nothing left at home to encourage them to return, they might be all the readier to face the perils that lay ahead. Each man was ordered to take with him 3 months' supply of flour. They persuaded their neighbors, the Raraki, Tulingi, and Latobrigi, who were to join them in the migration, to follow their own example and burn their towns and villages. And they also took with them as allies the Boii, who had previously lived on the other side of the Rhine but had crossed over into Austria, where they had attacked the town of Noraia. There were but 2 possible routes by which the Helvetii could leave their country. One was through the territory of the Sequani. It was a difficult route, with the Jura Mountains on one side and the Rhone on the other, so narrow that wagons could scarcely move along it in single file, and the high mountains that overhung the road would enable a mere handful of men to block the pass. The other route was through the Roman province. It was much easier and more convenient, since the Rhone, which flows between the territory of the Helvetii and that of the recently subdued Allobroges, can be forded at various points. There is also a bridge at the Allobrogian frontier town of Geneva, which connects that country with the Helvetii. The Allobroges were considered to be still disaffected toward Rome, and the Helvetii felt confident that, either by persuasion or by force, they could secure a free passage through the country. So, when everything was ready for departure, they fixed a date on which they were all to assemble on the banks of the Rhone. This date was the 28th of March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius. On receiving the news that the Helvetii intended to try to march through our province, I left Rome at once for Transalpine Gaul, and traveling as fast as possible, reached the neighborhood of Geneva. In the whole of Transalpine Gaul there was but 1 legion. I gave orders for the mobilization of as many more troops as possible, and had the bridge over the Rhone destroyed. When they heard of my arrival, the Helvetii sent a deputation of their chief man to me. The deputation was led by Namias and Verocloetius, and was instructed to say that their intentions in marching through the province were entirely peaceable. There simply existed no alternative route, and they asked me to allow them to do so without raising any objections. I remembered, however, that it was these Helvetii who had defeated and killed the consul Lucius Cassius and sent his army under the yoke. It did not seem to me that any concessions ought to be made to such people. They were no friends of ours, and I did not believe that if they got the chance of marching through the province, they would refrain from acts of robbery and violence. However, it was necessary to gain time for the mobilization of the troops which I had ordered to be raised. I therefore told the deputation that I should have to consider the matter at my leisure. They were to return, if they wished to raise question again on the 13th of April. Meanwhile, I used the legion which I had with me and the fresh troops which had been enlisted in the province to construct a wall 16 feet in height and a trench along the whole distance of 18 miles between the Lake of Geneva, where it flows into the Rhone, and the Jura Mountains on the frontier between the Helvetii and the Sequani. When this fortification was finished, I posted garrisons at various strong points along the line so as to make it easier to repulse the Helvetii if they should try to force their way through. The Helvetian deputation visited me again on the day I had fixed. I told them that I must act in accordance with the precedents and traditions of the Roman people, and was therefore unable to allow anyone to march through the province. I made it clear that if they attempted to use force, I would resist them. The Helvetii had failed to get what they wanted. They now made a number of attempts, sometimes by day, but more often by night, at breaking through our line. Sometimes they tried to get across by means of boats and rafts lashed together to form a bridge. Sometimes they forded the river at its shallowest points. However, they were faced by strong fortifications and by troops who concentrated quickly at the points of danger and poured a heavy fire on their attackers. In the end, they abandoned these attempts. The only road left to them was the one through the country of the Sequani, and this was too narrow to be practicable, unless the Sequani themselves were willing to let them use it. Acting on their own initiative, the Helvetii failed to secure the necessary permission, and therefore they sent a deputation to Dumnorix the Aeduan, asking him to use his good offices with the Sequani so as to get this permission for them. Dumnorix was a man who carried much weight among the Sequani. He was personally well liked and had spent money on increasing his popularity. He was also friendly toward the Helvetii, for his wife, the daughter of Orgetorix, had come from their country. He was extremely ambitious to make himself king, was implicated in revolutionary activities, and wished to have as many states as possible bound to him by ties of gratitude. He was therefore very willing to take on this commission, and arranged matters so that the Sequani promised to allow the Helvetii to march through their country. He organized an exchange of hostages to guarantee that the Sequani would allow the Helvetii freedom of passage, and the Helvetii would do no damage and resort to no violence while on the march. I now received information that the Helvetii proposed to march through the territory of the Sequani and the Aedui into the country of the Santones. This is quite near the frontiers of Toulouse, a state in the Roman province, and I recognize that the province itself would be in great danger if this were to happen. It would mean having a warlike tribe, hostile to Rome, on a frontier which had no geographical defenses and which led to areas that were particularly rich in grain. I therefore left my deputy commander, Titus Labienus, in charge of the fortifications at Geneva, and went myself to Italy with as much speed as possible. There I raised 2 new legions, withdrew 3 others from their winter quarters near Aquileia, and with these 5 marched back to Transalpine Gaul by the shortest route, which was over the Alps. While we were crossing the Alps, the Sutrones, Graioceli, and Caturiges occupied various heights and attempted to prevent the army from getting through. We fought several engagements with them before driving them off. 7 days after leaving Ocelum, which was our last stop in Cisalpine Gaul, we reached the territory of the Boconti in the Transalpine province. From here, we marched into the country of the Allobroges, and then on to the country of the Segusiavi, who are the first tribe outside the province on the other side of the Rhone. By this time, the Helvetii had marched with all their forces through the narrow passes of the country of the Sequani, and had reached and begun to pillage the country of the Aedui. Unable to defend themselves or preserve their property, the Aedui sent a deputation to me to ask for help. They claimed that their tribe had always been loyal to Rome, and that it was therefore not right for my army to be standing by inactive while their country was being laid waste, their children carried off into slavery, and their towns pillaged. At the same time, the Ambari, who are both kinsmen and allies of the Aedui, informed me that their fields had been laid waste, and that they were having the greatest difficulty in keeping their towns safe from enemy attack. Finally, the Allobroges, who had once owned property and inhabited villages across the Rhone, came to me for refuge and told me that they now had nothing left except the bare ground on which their possessions had stood. All this convinced me that I ought to take action at once and not remain inactive while the Helvetii went on to the country of the Santones, destroying all the possessions of our allies on their way. There is a river called the Seyon, which flows through the country of the Aedui and Sequani into the Rhone. The stream is so extraordinarily slow that when one looks at it, it is impossible to say in which direction it flows. The Helvetii were in the act of crossing this river by means of a bridge of boats and rafts, and my patrols came in with the information that 3/4 of them had already crossed the river, but about 1/4 was still on the near bank. I set out from camp soon after midnight with 3 legions and came up with that division of the enemy which had not yet crossed the river. They were hampered by their baggage, and our attack took them by surprise. We killed great numbers of them, and the rest took to flight and hid in the forests nearby. This particular division or clan, one of the 4 into which the people of the Helvetii are divided, was known as the Tigurini. It was the same Tigurini who, about 50 years previously, had marched out of their country alone, killed and defeated the consul Lucius Cassius, and sent his army under the yoke. So, whether by chance or by divine providence, that section of the Helvetii, which had inflicted such a terrible disgrace on Roman arms, was the first of them all to pay the penalty. In this action I had personal as well as patriotic reasons for rejoicing in the revenge which we took, since in the battle with Cassius, the Tigurini had also killed his second-in-command, Lucius Piso, the grandfather of that Lucius Piso who was now my father-in-law. After the battle, I had a bridge built over the Seyon, and brought the army across, so as to be able to pursue the remainder of the Helvetian forces. My sudden appearance had a disturbing effect upon the enemy when they observed that the business of crossing the river, which had caused them much trouble, and over which they had taken 20 days, had been done by us in the space of a single day. They sent a deputation to me which was led by Divico, who had commanded the Helvetian forces in the campaign against Cassius. The representations he made were as follows. If Rome would make peace with the Helvetii, then the Helvetii would go and settle wherever I decided that I would like them to be. If, on the other hand, I proposed to continue to treat them as enemies, I would do well to remember the traditional bravery of the Helvetii, and how Rome had suffered on a previous occasion. It was true that I had made a surprise attack on one of their clans at a time when the rest of them, who had crossed the river, were not able to come to the help of their comrades. But it would be unwise for me, on the basis of this incident, to overrate my own strength or despise theirs. The Helvetii had learned from their fathers and their ancestors to fight with courage rather than with guile or recourse to stratagems. I was therefore advised to think again and to avoid acting in such a way that this place where we parleyed might become famous in history for a disaster to the Roman people and the destruction of one of her armies. I replied as follows. As a result of what you have said, my mind is more firmly made up than ever. I remember well the events to which you refer, and I bitterly resent the misfortune which we then suffered, because we had done nothing to deserve it. If we had known that we had injured you in any way, it would not have been difficult for us to have taken the necessary precautions. As it was, we were deceived. We were not aware that we had done anything to give us cause for alarm, and it is not our way to peal alarm without good reason. But even if I were prepared to overlook these old insults, how could I forget the injuries which you have inflicted on us just recently? You attempted, after having been refused permission by me, to force your way through our province. You have robbed and made war against the Aitui, the Ambari, and the Alabroges. You may be insolent enough to boast of your victory and to preen yourselves for having escaped so long the punishment due you. Yet these facts point to one and the same conclusion. When the gods wish to punish wicked men for their crimes, they often allow them for a time a more than usual prosperity and an even longer impunity, simply so that they will suffer all the more bitterly when their fortunes eventually are reversed. Nevertheless, I am still willing to make peace on the following conditions. You must give me hostages as a security that you will do what you promise, and you must pay reparations for the damage you have done to the Aitui, the Alabroges, and their allies. Diviko replied that the Helvetii, throughout their long history, had always been accustomed to take, never to give, hostages. And this, he added, the Romans knew well enough. With these words, he went away. End of the campaign against the Helvetii. Next day, the Helvetii moved camp, as did I. Our whole cavalry force, consisting of about 4,000 men, raised from all parts of the province, from the Aitui and from their allies, was sent on ahead to observe the enemy's line of march. They followed up the enemy rear guard rather too eagerly, and, joining battle with the Helvetian cavalry on ground that was unfavorable, suffered a few casualties. The Helvetii were much elated by this engagement, having routed so many of our cavalry with a mere 500 of their own. Their morale improved, and their rear guard would often halt and challenge us to make another attack. However, I kept my men back from fighting. We had enough to do for the moment in preventing the enemy from foraging and looting and generally devastating the countryside. So, for about a fortnight, the two armies moved on, the enemy's rear guard and our vanguard always within 5 or 6 miles of each other. Meanwhile, I was constantly urging the Aitui to send the grain which their government had promised me. Gaul, as already stated, is a northern country, and because of the cold, the grain in the fields was still not ripe, nor was there even an adequate supply of food for the animals. Moreover, I was no longer able to rely, as before, on the supplies of grain which were brought up the Seyon in boats, because the Helvetii had moved away from the river, and I did not want to lose contact with them. Day after day, the Aitui kept putting things off, saying that the grain was being collected, it was actually on its way, it would arrive at any moment, and so forth. I realized that these postponements were going on indefinitely, and we were not far from the day on which the troops should be issued their rations. So I summoned a meeting of the Aituan chiefs, of whom there were a great many in our camp. Among them were Dibikiakus and Liskus, the latter of whom held the highest office in his state, being Vergobret, as the Aituans called him. The Vergobret is an annually elected magistrate with powers of life and death over his countrymen. I spoke severely to the Aituan chiefs, accusing them of being no help to me at all in this critical moment, when grain could neither be bought nor harvested, and when the enemy was so close to us. I pointed out that it was largely because of their entreaties that I had undertaken this campaign in the first place, a fact which made their betrayal of me even harder to tolerate. This speech of mine had its effect on Liskus, who now, at last, revealed some information which up to then he had kept secret. According to him, there were among the Aedui certain individuals who had great influence with the people and indeed were in their private capacity more powerful than the magistrates themselves. These men had been engaging in a criminal and seditious agitation designed to intimidate the people and prevent them from collecting the amount of grain due. Their general theme was that if the Aedui themselves could no longer hold supreme power in Gaul, it was better to have other Gauls rather than Romans as their overlords, for they were convinced that if the Romans conquered the Helvetii, their next step would be to deprive both the Aedui and the other Gallic tribes of their liberty. It was these same people, Liscus said, who were in the habit of informing the enemy of our plans and of everything that went on in our camp. He himself could do nothing to control them. Indeed, he fully realized that in giving me this information, as he felt obliged to do, he had put himself into considerable danger. And this was why he had kept silent for as long as he could. I felt pretty certain that the person to whom Liscus was referring was Dumnorix, the brother of Diviciacus. But because I did not want the affair to become the subject of general discussion, I quickly dismissed the meeting, asking Liscus to stay behind. When he was by himself, I put some more questions to him about what he had said at the meeting, and now he spoke with less restraint and more confidence. By secretly questioning various other people, I checked his information and found it to be correct. Dumnorix was the man responsible. Daring and unscrupulous, exceedingly popular with the masses because of his generosity, Dumnorix was aiming at a revolution. It appeared that for several years he had contracted to collect the customs and all the rest of the Aeduan taxes. He had paid very little for this contract, simply because nobody dared bid against him. In this way he had become even richer than before, and had amassed large sums to be used for bribery. He went about with a large bodyguard of cavalry, which he maintained at his own expense. He was a man of authority, not only in his own country, but in neighboring states. And to strengthen this influence of his abroad, he had arranged for his mother to marry one of the most distinguished nobles among the Bituriges, had himself taken a wife from the Helvetii, and had married his half-sister and other female relatives to men from various other states. Because of his marriage, he was strongly on the side of the Helvetii, and he had reasons of his own for hating both the Romans in general and me personally, because one of the results of our arrival in the country had been the diminution of his power and the restoration of his brother Diviciacus to the position of honor and authority which he had held previously. He was convinced that if we were defeated, the Helvetii would help him to become king, whereas if the country came under Roman control, he saw no prospects either of gaining the kingship or of keeping the influence which he had already. In the course of my inquiries, I also discovered that it was Dumnorix and his cavalry who were responsible for starting the flight of our whole cavalry force when it had suffered the defeat a few days previously. Dumnorix was the commander of the cavalry contingent that had been sent me by the Aedui, and when his men had started to run away, their panic had spread to all the rest. All this gave me good reason to distrust him, and the evidence was confirmed by other indisputable facts. It was Dumnorix who had arranged for the Helvetii to go through the country of the Sequani, and who had seen that hostages were exchanged. He had, moreover, done all this without any orders either from me or from his own government. Indeed, neither I nor they had known anything about it. And now he was being accused by the chief magistrate of the Aedui. It seemed to me, therefore, that I should be perfectly justified either in punishing him myself or in instructing his own government to do so. There was one objection, however, to following either of these courses. I had come to know Diviciacus, the brother of Dumnorix, well. He was entirely on our side, very devoted to me personally, and altogether a man who was quite remarkable for his loyalty, his fair-mindedness, and his good sense. I was afraid of hurting his feelings if I punished Dumnerix. Therefore, before taking any further steps, I summoned him to my quarters. Here, I asked the regular interpreters to withdraw, and spoke with Divikiakos through the medium of Gaius Valerius Procillus, a leading man in the province and a great friend of mine in whom I had the most complete confidence. I reminded Divikiakos of what he had himself heard said about Dumnerix in the Council of Chiefs, and I went on to tell him of the additional information I had received about his brother from various individuals. I then most solemnly begged him not to take offense, but to approve of my suggestion that I should either try the case myself and decide upon the penalty, or else instruct the Aeduan government to do so. Divikiakos threw his arms around me and burst into tears. He began to beg me not to be too severe with his brother. "I know well," he said, "that what you have told me is true, and no one is more sorry about it than I am. There was a time when, both at home and abroad, I had very great power, and Dumnerix, because of his youth, very little. It was through me that he grew great. Now he is using the strength and resources which I gave him not only to weaken me, but practically to destroy me. Nevertheless, I feel for him as a brother ought to feel, and I must also consider the question of public opinion. I myself am known to be a friend of yours. If you take severe measures against my brother, everyone will believe that I was also in favor of them, and the result will be that I shall become hated all over Gaul." He was continuing to speak, still weeping and still begging me to relent. But I took him by the hand and told him reassuringly that he need say no more, making him see that I had such goodwill for him that I was prepared for his sake to do as he asked and to forgive both the injury done to Rome and the grievance which I felt personally. I then had Dumnerix brought in, and in the presence of his brother told him the reasons I had for being dissatisfied with his conduct. I informed him of the results of my inquiries and of the complaints made against him by his fellow countrymen. I advised him to be careful not to give cause for suspicion in the future, and told him that it was only because of his brother Divikiakos that he was being forgiven for the past. After this, I had agents constantly on the watch, so that I could know what Dumnerix was doing, and with whom he was in communication. On the same day, my patrols informed me that the enemy had halted at the foot of a hill 8 miles from our camp. A party was sent to reconnoiter the hill and find out what the ascent was like on the further side. They reported that it was easy. So, after discussing my plans with Labienus, my second in command, I instructed him to set out soon after midnight with 2 legions and climb to the top of the hill. He was to be guided by the men who had just reconnoitered the ground. An hour or so later, I set out myself and marched toward the enemy by the same route as that which they had taken themselves. I sent the whole cavalry force ahead. In front of them were patrols under the command of Publius Considius, who was supposed to be a first-class soldier and had seen service under Lucius Sulla and later under Marcus Crassus. By dawn, Labienus had occupied the summit of the hill, and I was not more than 1.5 miles from the enemy's camp. As we discovered later from prisoners, the enemy had no idea that we were anywhere near. At this point, Considius came galloping up to me and told me that the hill which I had wanted Labienus to occupy was in fact occupied by the enemy. He had recognized them, he said, by their Gallic armor and the crests on their helmets. I withdrew my troops to the nearest high ground and formed them up in line of battle. In order that the enemy should be attacked simultaneously on both sides, I had instructed Labienus not to attack until he could see my troops near the enemy's camp. So, after seizing the hill, he waited for us to appear and made no move himself. It was already late in the day when my patrols put me in possession of the real facts. That the hill had all the time been in our hands, that the Helvetii had by now moved on, and that Considius had evidently lost his nerve and said that he had seen what was simply not visible. So, for the rest of the day, we followed the enemy with the usual interval between the armies and pitched camp 3 miles away from their camp. In 2 days' time, the troops were due to receive their rations. We were now not more than 16 miles from Bibracte, which is much the largest and best supplied of the Aeduan strongholds, and it seemed to me that something must be done to secure our grain supply. So on the next day, I stopped following the Helvetii and marched in the direction of Bibracte. This change of plan was reported to the enemy by some deserters from the Gallic cavalry commanded by Lucius Aemilius. The Helvetii may have believed that we were marching away because we were frightened, and our failure to attack on the previous day, after which we had occupied the high ground, would support such a view. Or they may have thought that they could cut us off from our grain supply. Whatever the reason, they too changed their plans and altered the direction of their march. They began to follow us and to harass our rear guard. Seeing what was happening, I withdrew my forces to the nearest hill and sent forward the cavalry to hold up the enemy's attack. In the meantime, I formed up the 4 veteran legions in 3 lines halfway up the hill. Behind them, on the summit, were posted the 2 legions that had recently been enlisted in Italy, and all the auxiliary troops. So the whole hillside was covered with men. Meanwhile, I ordered the packs to be collected in one place, which was to be entrenched by the troops in line on the higher ground. The Helvetii, with all their wagons, came after us. They deposited all their heavy baggage in one place, and then, fighting in very close order, drove back our cavalry and came on in a dense mass up to our front line. I first of all had my own horse taken out of the way, and then the horses of other officers. I wanted the danger to be the same for everyone, and for no one to have any hope of escape by flight. Then I spoke a few words of encouragement to the men before joining battle. Hurling their javelins from above, our men easily broke up the enemy's mass formation, and having achieved this, drew their swords and charged. In the fighting, the Gauls were seriously hampered because several of their overlapping shields were often pierced by a single javelin. The iron head would bend, and they could neither get it out nor fight properly with their left arms. Many of them, after a number of vain efforts at disentangling themselves, preferred to drop their shields and fight with no protection for their bodies. In the end, the wounds and the toil of battle were too much for them, and they began to retire to a hill about a mile away. This hill they occupied, and our men pressed on after them. However, we were now attacked by the Boii and Tulinki, who, some 15,000 strong, had been the rear guard in the enemy's column of march. They now launched an attack on our exposed right flank and swept around behind us. The Helvetii, who had retired to the hill, saw them go into action and themselves began to press forward again in a counter-attack. We formed a double front. The rear line faced about to meet the new attack, while the first and second lines went on fighting against those whom they had already defeated and driven back. This fighting in 2 directions went on for a long time and was bitterly contested. Finally, when they could stand up to us no longer, one division of the enemy retired, as they had begun to do originally, toward the higher ground, and the others fell back on the stockade, sheltering their wagons and baggage train. In the whole of this battle, which had lasted from midday until the evening, not a single man was seen to turn and run. Around the stockade, fighting went on far into the night. The enemy had drawn up their wagons so as to form a kind of rampart, and from this hurled down their weapons on our men as we came up, while others from underneath the wagons and between the wheels shot their native darts and javelins at us with damaging effect. It was a long fight, but in the end we gained possession of the baggage and the camp, and took as prisoners the daughter of Orgetorix and one of his sons. About 130,000 of the enemy survived the battle. They marched all that night without stopping for a moment's rest, and 3 days later reached the country of the Lingones. We had been unable to follow them since we spent 3 days in looking after the wounded and burying the dead. But I sent messengers with letters to the Lingones, warning them not to give the Helvetii food or help of any kind, and threatening, if they did so, to treat them also as enemies. Then, after the 3 days were up, I continued the pursuit, taking the whole army with me. The Helvetii had now no supplies of any kind, and could therefore do nothing except send a deputation to discuss terms of surrender. Their representatives met me on the road, flinging themselves on the ground before me in the attitude of suppliants, and with tears streaming from their eyes, they begged for peace. I told them that their army was to remain where it was until I arrived, and this order was obeyed. When I reached them, I demanded the surrender of hostages, arms, and those slaves of ours who had deserted to them. While the men were being rounded up and the arms collected, night fell, and about 6,000 men of the clan called Verbigene took advantage of the darkness to slip out of the Helvetian camp and make for the Rhine and the country of the Germans. They may have been in a panic, imagining that once their arms had been given up, they were going to be put to death. Or they may have hoped to get away safely, thinking that in such a vast number of prisoners, their own escape might not be discovered at once, or might not be noticed at all. However, as soon as I found out what had happened, I sent out orders to the native tribes through whose territory the escaped prisoners had passed, and demanded that they should round them up and bring them back to me, unless they wanted me to regard them as accomplices in the escape. My orders were carried out, and the men were treated as enemies are treated. As to all the rest, I accepted their surrender once they had produced the hostages and given up their arms and the runaway slaves. I ordered the Helvetii, the Tulingi, and the Latobrigi to go back to the lands which they had occupied before the migration started. Because they had lost all the produce of their land and had no means of subsistence, I instructed the Allobroges to supply them with grain. The Helvetii themselves were to rebuild the towns and villages which they had burned. My chief reason for taking these measures was that I did not want that part of the country from which the Helvetii had come to remain uninhabited. It was rich country, and I feared that the Germans from across the Rhine might move from their own land into the land of the Helvetii, and thus become neighbors of the Allobroges and of Roman Gaul. As for the Boii, who were known for their outstanding fighting qualities, the Aedui asked to be allowed to settle them in their own country. I granted their request. The Aedui gave them land and later made them full citizens with the same rights and privileges that they enjoyed themselves. I was shown some documents written in Greek script which had been found in the Helvetian camp. They turned out to be a complete list of the names of all those who had taken part in the migration and were able to bear arms. There were also separate lists of the children, old men, and women. The grand total came to 368,000 and was made up of 263,000 Helvetii, 36,000 Tulingi, 14,000 Latobrigi, 23,000 Rauraki, and 32,000 Boii. There were 92,000 men capable of bearing arms. On my orders, a census was taken of those who returned to their homes, and the number was found to be 110,000. At the conclusion of the campaign against the Helvetii, the leading men from nearly every state in Gaul came to me to offer their congratulations. They were fully aware, they said, that in this campaign I had been avenging wrongs done in the past by the Helvetii to Rome. Nevertheless, Gaul had benefited just as much as Rome by the result, since the Helvetii, when things were going perfectly well with them, had left their own country with the express purpose of making war on the whole of Gaul and bringing it into subjection to them. Their plan was to select out of the whole great country some particularly fertile and convenient area for themselves to occupy, and to make the rest of the states pay tribute to them. The deputies then asked to be allowed to summon, under my sponsorship, a council of the whole of Gaul on a date to be decided. They said that they had certain requests which they would like to submit to me once general agreement had been reached. I gave them permission to do this, and they fixed a day for the meeting of the council. Each of them took an oath not to divulge its proceedings unless authorized to do so by general consent of all members. Ariovistus. Preliminary moves. When this council had been held, the same tribal chiefs as before came back to me and asked to be allowed to meet me secretly for private discussions on a question which affected their personal safety and the good of the whole country. I granted their request, and at the interview they prostrated themselves before me and spoke with tears streaming. Anxious as they were, they said, to gain their requests, it was just as important for them that what they said should go no further. If it did, they would be likely to suffer for it most cruelly. Then Diviciacus, the Aeduan, who acted as their spokesman, gave the following account of the situation. In Gaul, he said, there were two large factions, one led by the Aedui and one by the Averni. For many years, these two had struggled bitterly between themselves for supremacy, until, in the end, the Arverni and Sequani had hired German mercenaries to help them. Originally, about 15,000 Germans had crossed the Rhine, but soon these fierce and violent savages took a liking for the good land and the high standard of living to be found in Gaul, and many more crossed over. There were now about 120,000 of them in the country. The Aedui and their dependent states had fought in battle with the Germans over and over again, but they had been defeated with disastrous results, losing all their nobles, the whole of their national council, and their cavalry. After these disastrous... Book 5, 54 BC. The Second Invasion of Britain. In the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, before setting out from winter quarters to Italy, as I did every year, I instructed the generals whom I had left in command of the legions to have the old fleet prepared and to arrange for the building of as many new ships as possible during the winter. I told them exactly how I wanted these new ships to be built. So that they could be loaded quickly and beached easily, I had them made with a rather lower freeboard than is usual in the Mediterranean. This seemed safe enough, since I had noticed that in the Channel, owing to the frequent ebb and flow of the tides, the waves are comparatively small, so that they could carry a large cargo, which would include numerous animals. I had the ships made rather broader than those we normally use in other waters. They were all to be fitted with sails and oars, and this was made all the easier because of their low freeboard. Materials for equipping the ships were to be brought from Spain. I myself, as soon as I had finished dealing with the assizes in northern Italy, set out for Illyria, since I had heard that the Perusti were making raids on that part of the province which was nearest to them, and were doing much damage. When I arrived, I ordered the local communities to raise troops and told them where to assemble. As soon as the Perusti heard of this, they sent a deputation to me to explain that their government had had nothing whatever to do with these raids. They were ready, they said, to make every possible kind of reparation for the damage that had been done. I accepted this statement of theirs and ordered them to give me hostages who were to be delivered on a date which I named. And I told them that if they failed to do this, I should make war on them. The hostages were brought as ordered on the right day, and I appointed arbitrators to assess the damage that each community had sustained, and to fix the amount of reparations due. After dealing with this matter, I held the assizes in Illyria, and then returned to northern Italy. From here, I set out to rejoin the army. On arriving in Gaul, I made a tour of inspection of all the winter camps. I found that, in spite of a very great shortage of materials, the men had worked magnificently. They had built about 600 ships of the type described above and 28 warships. These would all be ready for launching in a few days. I congratulated the men and the officers who had been in charge of this operation, told them what I wanted done next, and ordered the whole fleet to assemble at Boulogne. I had discovered that from this port one can make the easiest crossing to Britain, the distance being about 28 miles from the continent. I left sufficient troops for carrying out this task, and set out myself for the country of the Treveri with 4 legions, marching light, and 800 cavalry. I took this action because the Treveri had failed to attend the Gallic councils, had neglected my orders, and were believed to be making overtures to the Germans across the Rhine. The Treveri have much the most powerful cavalry in Gaul, and also a large army of infantry. I have already mentioned that this country borders on the Rhine. At this time, 2 of their chiefs, Indutiomarus and Cingetorix, were struggling for supreme power in the state. As soon as it was known that I was approaching with an army, Cingetorix came to me. He assured me that he and all his followers would loyally abide by their alliance with Rome, and told me what the situation was among the Treveri. Indutiomarus, on the other hand, began to prepare for war. He assembled forces of cavalry and infantry, and hid all those who were too old or too young for military service in a huge forest of the Ardennes, which stretches right across the country of the Treveri, from the Rhine to the frontier of the Remi. However, several chiefs of the tribe, partly because they were friends of Cingetorix, partly because they were overawed by the presence of our army, came to me and began to beg my support in various private interests of their own, it being impossible for them, so they said, to speak openly in the public interest. Indutiomarus now feared that he would be deserted by everyone, and sent a deputation to me himself. He claimed that the reason he had been unwilling to leave his own people and come to see me was that he could best keep the tribe loyal by staying with them. If all the nobility had left, he feared that the common people would, in their ignorance, have made some serious mistake. As it was, he said, he had everything under control, and with my permission he proposed to visit me, and put both himself and his tribe under my protection. I realized well enough the purpose of this speech, and also the real reason why Indutiomarus was afraid to go on with his original plan. However, now that everything was ready for the campaign in Britain, I did not want to have to waste the summer among the Treveri. I therefore ordered Indutiomarus to bring 200 hostages with him when he came. The hostages were duly delivered, among them his son and all his family, whom I had asked for especially. I assured Indutiomarus that they would come to no harm, and urged him to remain loyal to us. At the same time, however, I had private interviews with the other chiefs of the Treveri, and won them over to the side of Cingetorix. I was conscious that Cingetorix deserved to be helped by me in this way, and I also thought it very important that one who had given such remarkable evidence of his loyalty to me should be as strong as possible among his own people. Indutiomarus, however, was bitterly offended by my action. He realized that he was losing prestige in the tribe, and the resentment he felt about this made him hate us even more than he had before. When this business had been settled, I marched with the legions to Boulogne. I was informed there that 60 ships, which had been built in the country of the Meldi, had been driven off their course by a storm, and compelled to return to their starting point. But I found all the rest fully equipped and ready for sailing. 4,000 cavalry from all parts of Gaul, and the chieftains of the various tribes had also assembled at Boulogne. I had decided to leave behind only a few chieftains of proved loyalty to myself, and to take the rest with me by way of hostages, since I feared that otherwise there might be a rising in Gaul during my absence. Among these chieftains was Domnorix the Aeduan, who had already been mentioned in this narrative. He was one of those whom I was particularly anxious to have with me, since I knew that he aimed at winning power for himself by revolutionary means, and also that he was a courageous man with great influence among his countrymen. I discovered from some Gauls with whom I had stayed that he told the council of the Aedui that I was going to offer him the position of king of the tribe. a statement which the Aedui very much resented, though they did not dare to send a deputation to me to protest against my alleged decision or ask me to give it up. Now Dumnorix began to put forward every possible reason for asking to be left behind in Gaul. He was unused to sailing, he said, and was frightened of the sea. Next, there were religious reasons which prevented him from going. He soon saw, however, that I was determined not to let him have his own way, and when he realized that there was no hope of getting what he wanted, he began to make approaches to the other Gallic chieftains, talking with them privately and trying to persuade them to stay on the continent. He played on their fears by suggesting that I had an object of my own in thus stripping Gaul of all her nobility. My plan was, he said, to bring across into Britain and there put to death all those whom I did not dare treat in this way in the sight of their own countrymen. He pledged his own word to the rest and asked from them a guarantee in return that they would all work together for what they conceived to be the interests of Gaul. I received reports of these intrigues from several people, and when I saw what the situation was, I decided that in view of the particular consideration which I had always shown for the Aedui, I ought to do everything I possibly could to keep Dumnorix under control and prevent him from carrying out his plans. And as in fact I saw that he was becoming more reckless and irresponsible every day, it was clearly necessary to take precautions so as to stop him from doing any harm to me personally or to the general interests of Rome. We were delayed at Bologna for about 25 days because the northwest wind, the prevailing wind in these parts, made it impossible to sail, and during this time I did my best to see to it that Dumnorix remained loyal, though at the same time I took steps to find out what his real plans were. In the end, we got the right weather for sailing, and I issued orders for the embarkation of both infantry and cavalry. While everyone's attention was occupied with carrying out these orders, Dumnorix, accompanied by some Aeduan cavalrymen, slipped out of camp without my knowledge and started to go home. As soon as I was informed of this, I put off sailing and, leaving everything else aside, sent a strong force of cavalry to capture him. If he resisted or refused to obey, he was to be killed. For I did not imagine that a man who had flouted my authority to my face was likely to behave sensibly when I was not there. In fact, when he was ordered to come back, he attempted to resist and to fight off his pursuers, calling on his followers to help him and repeatedly shouting out that he was a free man and the citizen of a free country. In accordance with my instructions, he was surrounded and killed. All the Aedui who were with him returned to camp. When this was done, I left Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry. His orders were to guard the ports, to arrange for our food supplies, to keep himself informed about what was going on in Gaul, and in the event of an emergency, to take whatever measures he thought fit. I myself, with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, set sail about sunset. We started with a gentle southwesterly wind, but about midnight, the wind dropped. Failing to keep our course, we were carried on too far by the tidal current, and at dawn we saw Britain far away behind us on our left. Once again, we followed the turn of the tide and attempted to row to the part of the island that, as we had discovered the past summer, was the best place for making a landing. The soldiers worked magnificently. Pulling at the oars without stopping, they managed to make the heavily loaded transports keep up with the warships. The whole fleet reached the coast of Britain about midday. Not a single enemy was in sight. In fact, as we found out afterward from prisoners, large enemy forces had assembled there, but had been terrified by the great numbers of our ships, and had withdrawn from the beach and hidden themselves on the higher ground. There must indeed have been more than 800 ships, all visible at once, what with the addition of those that had survived from last year, and various extra ships that had been built by individuals for their own use. The army was disembarked, and a suitable place was chosen for our camp. Then, after we had discovered from prisoners where the enemy's forces had taken up position, I left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry on the shore to guard the ships, and started out in the direction of the enemy soon after midnight. Quintus Atrius was left in charge of the fleet, and I had no anxiety about its safety, as the ships were lying at anchor on an open shore of soft sand. A night march of about 12 miles brought us in sight of the enemy's forces. They had moved down with their cavalry and chariots from the high ground to a river, and here they attempted to check us by joining battle. They were driven back by our cavalry, but concealed themselves in the woods, where they had an extremely good position, strong in itself and strongly fortified. No doubt it had been made ready previously for some war among themselves, for every entrance to the place was blocked by numbers of trees that had been felled. The Britons themselves came out of the woods to fight in small detachments, and tried to prevent our men from getting inside their fortifications. But the men of the 7th Legion, locking their shields together in tortoise formation, threw up a ramp against the fortifications, took the position, and drove the enemy out of the woods at the cost of only a few wounded. I forbade them to press the pursuit far, both because I was ignorant of the country and because much of the day had already gone, and I wanted to leave time for entrenching our camp. Next day, early in the morning, I divided the infantry and cavalry into 3 divisions, and sent them out as flying columns to pursue the retreating enemy. They had already gone some way, so that only the rear guards of the column were visible, when some horsemen came from Quintus Atrius with the news that on the previous night a great storm had damaged nearly all the ships and thrown them up on shore. The anchors and cables had failed to hold, and the sailors and steersmen had not been able to do anything in the face of the violence of the storm. So the ships had collided with each other, and very great damage had been done. When I heard this news, I ordered the legions and cavalry to be recalled. If attacked on the road, they were to beat off the attack, but continue marching. I myself returned to the fleet and saw with my own eyes that the situation was almost exactly as it had been described to me by the messengers and their dispatches. About 40 ships were a total loss, but it seemed that it would be possible to repair the rest, though this would mean much hard work. I therefore picked out from the legions all soldiers who were skilled craftsmen and sent instructions for others to be brought over from the continent. And I wrote to Labienus asking him to put his troops to work and get as many ships constructed as possible. Meanwhile, I decided that, in spite of the enormous labor involved, the best thing to be done was to have all the ships beached and included within the line of the camp's fortifications. We spent about 10 days in getting this done, the work going on continuously, day and night. Once the ships were beached and the camp really well fortified, I set out for the point from which I had returned, leaving behind the same forces as before to guard the ships. When I reached the position from which we had retired, I found that in the interval, British forces in greater numbers had come in from all parts of the country. By general consent, the supreme command in war had been given to Cassivelaunus, a chief whose territory begins about 75 miles inland from the sea, and is separated from the territory of the coastal tribes by a river called the Thames. Previously, there had been a continual state of war between Cassivelaunus and the other tribes, but our arrival had had such an effect on the Britons that they had agreed to appoint him as commander-in-chief. The interior of Britain is inhabited by people who claim, on the strength of their own tradition, to be indigenous to the island. The coastal districts are inhabited by invaders from Belgium, who came originally for the sake of plunder, and then, when the fighting was over, remained and began to live by agriculture. They nearly all bear the names of the states from which they came before they crossed into Britain. The population is very large indeed. Farm buildings, which are very like those of the Gauls, are to be seen everywhere, and there are great numbers of cattle. For money, they use either coins of bronze or gold, or iron ingots of a fixed standard of weight. Tin is found in the Midland area and iron near the coast. but there is not much of it. The bronze that they use is imported. Every sort of timber that one gets in Gaul grows in Britain, except for beech and pine. They think it wrong to eat hares, chickens, or geese, but keep these animals as pets to amuse themselves. The climate is more temperate than in Gaul, and the cold seasons are less severe. Britain is shaped like a triangle. One side faces Gaul, and one corner of this side, where Kent is, points east. It is to this part of the coast that nearly all the ships from Gaul put in. The lower corner of this side points south. The length of this side is about 500 miles. Another side faces westward, toward Spain. In this direction is Ireland, which is estimated to be about half the size of Britain, and is the same distance from Britain as Britain is from Gaul. Halfway between Britain and Ireland is an island called the Isle of Man, and it is thought that there are several other smaller islands too. In these islands, according to some accounts, there is continued night for 30 days at midwinter. On this point we made a number of inquiries but found out nothing. However, by making accurate measurements with a water clock, we did discover that the nights are shorter than on the continent. The length of this western side of Britain is, according to the opinion of the natives themselves, 700 miles. The third side faces north and has no land opposite it, though the eastern corner looks out roughly toward Germany. This side is supposed to be 800 miles long. Thus, the whole island is 2,000 miles in circumference. Much of the most civilized of the Britons are those who live in Kent, a part of the country which is entirely maritime and where the people have a way of life very much like that of the Gauls. Most of the tribes in the interior do not grow grain, but live on milk and meat, and are clothed in skins. All Britons dye their bodies with woad, which gives them a blue color, and thus produces a terrifying effect when they go into battle. They wear their hair long, and shave every part of the body except the head and upper lip. Wives are shared between groups of 10 or 12 men, particularly between brothers or between fathers and sons. But the children born from these unions are considered to belong to the man to whom the woman was married first. On the march, the enemy cavalry and charioteers fought a fierce engagement with our cavalry, but the result was that our men proved themselves superior in every way and drove them off into the woods or into the hills. However, we pressed the pursuit too far, and though we killed a number of them, we lost some men ourselves. Then, after an interval, when our men were off their guard and busy on the work of entrenching our camp, the enemy suddenly rushed out of the woods, charged down on the detachment that was on duty in front of the camp, and made a vigorous attack on them. In support, I sent up 2 cohorts, the first of their respective legions, which took position quite close to each other. But our men were disconcerted by the unfamiliar tactics with which they were faced, and the enemy, showing great daring, broke through the gap between the cohorts and got away safely. That day, one of our senior officers, Quintus Liberius Durus, was killed in action. More cohorts were sent forward and the enemy were driven back. The action had been fought in front of the camp with the whole army looking on, and it was clear that in fighting of this kind, our men were at a disadvantage against such an enemy because of the weight of armor which we carried. We could not pursue them when they retired, and we did not dare to go far from the standards. It was clear, too, that things were far from easy for our cavalry, for the enemy often retreated deliberately, and then, when they had drawn our cavalry away from the support of the legions, leaped down from their chariots and started fighting on foot, with all the odds in their favor. Another difficulty was in the fact that they never fought in close order, but always in scattered groups with wide intervals between them. Moreover, they had reserves posted at strategic points, so that one unit could cover another's retreat, and strong fresh troops could relieve those who were tired. Next day, the enemy took up a position on hills some distance away from our camp. They only appeared in small parties, and though they made some assaults on our cavalry, attacked less vigorously than on the day before. But at midnight, when I had sent out 3 legions and all the cavalry under the General Gaius Trebonius to get forage, the enemy suddenly swooped down from all sides on the foragers and pressed their attack right up to the ranks of the legions, which were in battle order. Our men charged them fiercely and drove them back. After this, the pursuit continued. Our cavalry, seeing the legions behind them and relying on their support, drove the enemy before them in headlong flight, killing great numbers and giving them no chance to rally and make a stand or jump down from their chariots. The immediate effect of this rout was that the additional enemy forces that had come in from all over the country began to disperse. They never afterwards put their whole army into the field against us. After discovering what the enemy's plans were, I led the army inland to the River Thames on the frontier of Cassivelaunus' country. There is only one point where the river can be forded, and even here the crossing is a difficult one. I observed when we reached this place that large enemy forces were drawn up ready for battle on the opposite bank. The bank itself was fortified with sharp stakes fixed along it, and as we were informed by prisoners and deserters, other stakes of the same kind had been driven into the bed of the stream and were hidden by the water. I at once ordered the cavalry to go ahead and the legions to follow them. Our soldiers crossed with only their heads above water, but they moved so fast and showed such fighting spirit that the enemy were unable to stand up to the combined attack of our cavalry and infantry. They abandoned their positions on the bank and fled. As already stated, Cassivelaunus had now given up all idea of fighting a pitched battle. He had disbanded most of his forces, but kept back about 4,000 charioteers. With these, he followed closely on our line of march, keeping always a little way off our route and concealing himself in the woods and thickets. When he had found out in what direction we were going to go, he drove into the woods all the cattle and human beings that were in the fields. Then, whenever our cavalry ranged any distance over the fields to get plunder or lay waste the country, he sent his charioteers from the forests by every available track or path to engage them in battle. Our cavalry were in great danger from these charioteers, and the fear of them prevented us from extending our operations very far. All I could do was to tell the cavalry to keep in contact with the marching column of the legions, which meant that we could only burn and ravage the countryside over an area which could be covered by the strenuous marches of our infantry. In the meantime, a deputation came to me from the Trinobantes, perhaps the strongest state in this part of the country. It was from this state that young Mandubracius had come to Gaul and put himself under my protection. He had had to fly for his life after his father, king of the Trinobantes, had been murdered by Cassivelaunus. The deputation which now arrived offered the surrender of the tribe and promised to carry out all my orders. They begged me to protect Mandubracius from Cassivelaunus and to send him back to his own country as supreme ruler. I told them to bring me 40 hostages and a supply of grain for the army, and I sent Mandubracius back to them. My orders were carried out promptly, both the grain and the required number of hostages being delivered. Now that the Trinobantes were taken under Roman protection and preserved from suffering any harm at the hands of our troops, other tribes, the Cenemagni, Singotiaci, Anchialites, Bibroci, and Cassi, also sent deputations and offered to surrender. I discovered from them that we were now quite near the main stronghold of Cassivelaunus. It was a position protected by forests and marshes, and considerable numbers of men and cattle had been brought together there. Incidentally, what the Britons describe as a stronghold is any position in a thick forest which they have fortified with a rampart and trench, and which they use as a place of refuge from invading enemy forces. We now started for this stronghold and found that it was extremely well placed and extremely well fortified. Nevertheless, we moved directly against it, attacking it from two sides. There was a brief resistance, but the enemy could not face the vigor of our assault and rushed out of the place on another side. We found a great quantity of cattle in the stronghold, and many of the enemy were captured or killed while trying to escape. While these operations were going on, Casavalaunus sent messengers to Kent, the aforementioned district by the sea, ordering the 4 kings of that part of the country, Cingetorix, Carvilius, Teximagulus, and Segovax, to mobilize all their forces and make a surprise attack on our naval camp. The Kentish army duly appeared in front of our camp, but our men made a sortie, and after killing great numbers of them and capturing one of their leaders, a man of noble birth called Lugutrix, retired again without loss. When he received the news of this engagement, Casavalaunus already dismayed defeats by the devastation of his country, and particularly by the fact that the tribes were beginning to come over to us, sent a deputation to me to ask for terms of surrender, using Comius the Atrebation as an intermediary. I had decided to winter on the continent in view of the danger of sudden uprisings among the Gauls. Not much of the summer was left, and I knew that for this short time the Britons could easily avoid any decisive action. I therefore ordered hostages to be delivered, fixed the tribute to be paid annually by Britain to Rome, and gave strict orders to Casavalaunus to avoid doing any harm to Mandubracius or the Trinobantes. As soon as the hostages were delivered, I led the army back to the sea, where we found the ships repaired. After they had been launched, I decided, in view of the large number of prisoners we had, and the fact that some ships had been lost in the storm, to make the return journey in 2 trips. Actually, it so happened that out of the whole of these great fleets on all their voyages, both in this and in the preceding year, not a single ship with troops aboard was lost. While on the other hand, out of the ships which were sent back to me empty from the continent, that is, those on their way from Gaul after disembarking the first contingent, and the second fleet which had been built under the supervision of Labienus, very few indeed reached their proper destination, nearly all of them being forced back to the point from which they started. I waited some time in vain for these ships. Then, being afraid that the weather might prevent us from sailing at all, since it was nearly the time of the equinox, I had to put more men than I would normally have done aboard the ships I had. The sea then became absolutely calm. We weighed anchor soon after 9 p.m., and reached land quite safely with the whole fleet at dawn on the following day. A revolt in Gaul. Destruction of a Roman army. After we had beached the ships, a council of the Gallic chiefs was held at Amiens. That year there had been a drought in Gaul, and the harvest had been a bad one. I was therefore compelled to adopt different methods from usual in arranging winter quarters for the legions and to distribute them over a large number of states. One legion under Gaius Fabius was sent to the Morini, another under Quintus Cicero to the Nervi, and a third under Lucius Roscius to the Aesubi. A 4th legion, with Titus Labienus in command, was ordered to winter among the Remi on their frontier with the Treveri. 3 more legions were quartered among the Belgi. They were commanded by the quaestor, Marcus Crassus, and the generals Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius. One other legion, which had recently been raised in the country north of the Po, together with 5 extra cohorts, was sent under the command of Quintus Titorius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta into the country of the Eburones. This tribe, most of whose territory lies between the Meuse and the Rhine, was governed by the chiefs Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. By distributing the legions in this way, I thought that we should most easily be able to meet the difficulties of securing our grain supply. In fact, the winter camps of all the legions, except for the one under Roscius, which had been sent into a perfectly quiet and peaceful area, were within 100 miles of each other. For the time being, I decided to stay in Gaul myself until I was informed that all the legions had reached their destinations and had fortified their camps. Among the Carnutes was a man of noble birth called Tasgetius, whose ancestors had been kings of the tribe. He had been most remarkably useful to me in all my campaigns, and in recognition of his great abilities and his loyalty to me, I had restored him to the position once held by his ancestors. He had already been king for more than 2 years, but now, with the open approval of many people among the Carnutes, his enemies assassinated him. I was informed of this crime, and since it appeared that many people were involved in it, I was afraid that they might use their influence to make the whole state revolt. I therefore instructed Lucius Plancus to leave Belgium and proceed at once to the country of the Carnutes. Here he was to spend the winter, and was also to arrest and send to me those whom he found guilty of the murder of Tasgetius. Meanwhile, dispatches reached me from the Quaestor and from all the generals in command of legions. They informed me that they had reached their quarters and that the winter camps were fortified. About a fortnight later, trouble suddenly began. The originators of the revolt were Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. After coming to meet Sabinus and Cotta on the frontiers of their territory and bringing supplies of grain to our camp, they had been incited by messages from Indutiomarus of the Treveri to revolt against us. They swept down and overwhelmed a party of our men who were collecting wood, and then came on in large numbers to attack the camp. Our troops quickly armed and mounted the rampart. A detachment of Spanish cavalry was sent out from one of the gates and fought a successful action against the enemy horsemen, and giving up all hopes of success, the enemy withdrew from the attack. Then, as they usually do in such cases, they called out loudly, asking for someone from our side to come out and discuss matters with them. They claimed to have something to say which would be beneficial to both parties and which would lead to a settlement of all matters in dispute. 2 of our people were sent out to confer with the enemy. Gaius Arpanius, a Roman gentleman who was a personal friend of Sabinus, and a Spaniard called Quintus Junius, who had often previously been employed by me on various missions to Ambiorix. In the speech which he made to these 2, Ambiorix began by acknowledging that he was under a great debt of gratitude to me personally. I had relieved him from the tribute which he had always paid in the past to the neighboring tribe of the Adjuatuki, and I had restored to him his sons and nephew, who had been sent to the Adjuatuki as hostages, and then been enslaved and kept in chains. As to the attack which had just been made on our camp, he said it had been carried out against his will and against his judgment. He had been forced into it by his fellow tribesmen, over whom he exercised a control which was very strictly limited. Indeed, his people had as much power over him as he had over his people, and the reason why his state had taken up arms was that it could not resist the general movement of the Gauls, which had just taken place. This fact could easily be proved. He was not a person of great importance, and was hardly so ignorant of the real situation as to imagine that his army could defeat the Romans. But what had happened was this. The whole of Gaul had got together and chosen this day for making attacks on every one of the Roman camps, so that one legion could not come to the help of another. It would not have been easy, he said, for one who was a Gaul himself to have refused to act with the others, especially when the object of the whole plan was to recover the national liberty. However, so far as the claims of patriotism were concerned, he had done his duty. What he now wanted to do was to show his consideration for what he owed me in return for my kindness to him. He was bound to Sabinus by ties of hospitality, and in the name of those ties, he most earnestly begged him to think of his own safety and of the safety of the troops under his command. A great force of German mercenaries had already crossed the Rhine and were due to arrive in 2 days. It was for the Romans themselves to decide whether or not it would be advisable to withdraw their troops from the camp before the tribes in the neighborhood could realize what the position was and march to the camp either of Cicero, who was 50 miles away, or of Labienus, who was a little farther. One thing, said Ambiorix, he would promise and would guarantee by oath, and that was that he would give them a safe conduct through his own country. He pointed out that in making this offer, he was doing the best thing for his own state by relieving them of the burden of a Roman army, and at the same time was doing something to repay me for the kindness I had shown him. After making this speech, Ambiorix withdrew, and Arpanius and Junius reported what they had been told to the generals, who were much disturbed by the sudden turn which events had taken. It was true that the information just received came from the enemy, but they did not think that it ought to be disregarded. There was one particularly disquieting factor. It scarcely seemed credible that an obscure and insignificant tribe like the Eburones dared to take the initiative in making war on Rome. Ambiorix's message was therefore discussed at a council of war. There was a wide difference of opinion among those present. The view expressed by Cotta and by several of the officers and senior centurions was that nothing should be done in a hurry, and that there was no justification for leaving their winter quarters without an order from me personally. Cotta claimed that, however many Germans might arrive, the fortifications of the camp were strong enough to keep them out. This had been proved by the fact that they had held out extremely well against the original enemy attack, and had inflicted a number of casualties. He pointed out, too, that they were adequately supplied with grain, and that before long help would reach them from the nearest camps or from some other force which I would send to their relief. Finally, it would be, he said, about the most irresponsible and disgraceful thing possible to take the advice of an enemy on matters of real importance to themselves. Sabinus disagreed. They would be leaving things too late, he insisted, if they waited for larger enemy armies, reinforced by Germans, to concentrate, or if, in the meantime, some disaster overtook the neighboring Roman camps. They had only a short time in which to make up their minds. In his own view, I had already set out for Italy. Otherwise, the Carnutes would not have decided upon the murder of Tasgetius, nor, if I had been in Gaul, would the Eburones have found the self-confidence to attack our camp. It was not, he said, a question of taking advice from the enemy. He was considering the facts. The Rhine was not far away. The Germans were in an angry and resentful mood as a result of the death of Ariovistus and our victories in past campaigns. The Gauls were burning with indignation at all the insults suffered since they had been brought into subjugation to Rome, and at the loss of their former prestige in war. Finally, how could anyone imagine that Ambiorix could have acted as he had done unless he had been quite sure of what he was doing? Sabinus declared that his own plan was safe either way. If, in fact, there was no serious danger, they would reach the nearest legion in perfect safety. If, on the other hand, the whole of Gaul was in alliance with the Germans, then the only chance of escape was in moving at once. As for Cotta and the others who disagreed, what would be the result of adopting their plan? It might be safe enough for the moment, but it most certainly involved the danger of a long siege and death by starvation. The two opposing views were discussed. Cotta and the senior centurions still objected most strongly to the plan of Sabinus. Then Sabinus raised his voice so that many of the ordinary soldiers could hear him, and shouted out, "Have your own way, then, if you must. You will not find me more frightened of death than the rest of you. But these soldiers of ours will be perfectly aware of what is happening, and if things go wrong, they will hold you responsible for it. If it were not for you, by the day after tomorrow, they would be with their comrades in the nearest camp, ready to fight alongside them, instead of being abandoned and isolated from the rest, to die, either by famine or by the sword. The members of the council rose from their places, gathered round the two generals, and implored them not to endanger everything by disagreeing so violently. Things will be easy, they said, whether we go or stay, provided that we all are agreed on what should be done. But if we go on quarreling, we might as well give up hope. The discussion continued until midnight. Finally, Cotter yielded to the pressure brought to bear on him and gave way. Sabinus's plan was adopted, and orders were issued for the army to leave camp at dawn. That night, no one slept. Each man was going through his kit to see what he could carry with him, and how much of his winter equipment he would have to leave behind. They went over every possible argument, proving that it was safe to go and dangerous to remain, and so exhausted themselves by staying awake that, in fact, their danger was increased. At dawn, they left camp in a long, straggling column with a great deal of heavy baggage. It appeared as though they were convinced that Ambiorix, who had given them the idea, was not an enemy, but the very best of friends. From the noise and general disturbance of the night, the enemy had gathered that we were going to leave and had posted 2 ambushes in a good position in the woods, well hidden from observation, about 2 miles away. Here, they waited for the Romans to arrive, and when the greater part of our force had descended into a deep ravine, they suddenly appeared at both ends of the column, falling upon the rear guard and trying to prevent the men in front from climbing out of the defile. They were thus engaging us on ground where all the advantages were on their side. At this point, Sabinus, who up to now had had no idea that such a thing could happen, began to grow alarmed. He hurried around, trying to get the troops into position. But even this he did nervously, making it obvious that he had completely lost control of the situation, as usually happens when one is forced to start planning in the middle of an action. Cotter, on the other hand, had thought that something like this might happen on the march, and had therefore been against leaving the camp. Now he did everything possible to save the army, leading and encouraging the men like a good general, and fighting in the line like a good soldier. Finding that the length of the column made it impossible for them to attend to everything personally, and to see what was needed at every point, the generals passed word along the line to abandon the baggage and form up in a circle. Considering the emergency, one cannot say that this was a bad plan. Nevertheless, it had unfortunate results, lowering the morale of our own troops and making the enemy all the more ready to attack, since they thought that we were acting in this way because we were in a panic and had given up hope. Then, too, as was bound to happen, a number of soldiers left the ranks to find and get hold of their most cherished possessions in the baggage train, shouting and cursing their luck as they did so. The natives, on the other hand, acted most intelligently. Their leaders passed the word around among their whole army that no one was to leave the ranks. All the plunder was theirs, and everything left by the Romans was reserved for them alone. Meanwhile, they were told to make up their minds that everything depended on winning the battle. The Gauls showed as much courage and as much ardor as we did. Yet our men, let down as they had been by their commander, and with all the luck against them, still relied on their fighting qualities to save them, and whenever one of our cohorts charged forward, great numbers of the enemy fell before it. Ambiorix, seeing what was happening, instructed his men to hold their weapons at long range, and not to come too close to us. Whenever we charged, they were to give ground. Their light armor and their constant training would enable them to do this without any risk. Then, when our men fell back into line, they were to counterattack. These orders were carefully carried out. Whenever a cohort left the circle and charged, the enemy fell back with the utmost rapidity. Meanwhile, the attacking cohort was of course unprotected on its right flank, and thus exposed to a shower of enemy missiles. And when it began to retire to its original position in the circle, it was practically surrounded, both by those who had fallen back in the first place, and by the nearest enemy units who had remained in their positions. If, on the other hand, our soldiers merely tried to hold their ground in the circle, they had no chance at all of showing their fighting qualities. Huddled closely together, they were an easy target for the weapons hurled at them by that great mass of men. Yet, in spite of all the difficulties, and in spite of very heavy casualties, they still stood firm. Much of the day had gone by. They had been fighting from dawn till 2 p.m., and in all this time they had done nothing unworthy of themselves. In this fighting, Titus Balventius, a gallant soldier most highly respected by everyone, who last year had been chief centurion of his legion, had both thighs transfixed with a javelin. Another centurion of the same rank, Quintus Lucanius, was killed in a most gallant attempt to rescue his own son, who had been surrounded. Cotta himself, while cheering on the cohorts, going from company to company, was wounded by a sling stone which struck him full in the face. Sabinus was alarmed at the way things were going. In the distance he could see Ambiorix urging on his men, and he sent Cnaeus Pompeius, his interpreter, to him to ask for quarter for himself and his troops. In reply to this appeal, Ambiorix said that Sabinus could come and speak to him if he wished. So far as the soldiers were concerned, he hoped that he would be able to persuade his men to spare their lives. In any case, he would personally guarantee that Sabinus himself should come to no harm. Sabinus then went to the wounded Cotta and proposed that they should both withdraw from the fight and go together to discuss matters with Ambiorix, who he hoped might be persuaded to grant them their lives and the lives of their troops. But Cotta said that he was not going to make approaches to any enemy who still carried arms, and nothing would make him change his mind. Sabinus ordered all officers and senior centurions who were with him at the moment to follow him. When he approached Ambiorix, he was told to lay down his arms, which he did, and instructed those who were with him to do also. He then joined in a conversation with Ambiorix about terms. Ambiorix deliberately prolonged the discussion, and Sabinus was gradually surrounded and then killed. The natives at once raised their customary cry of triumph and, yelling and screaming, charged down upon our army and broke through the ranks. Cotta fell fighting where he stood, and most of the troops died with him. The remainder retired to the camp from which they had set out. One of them, Lucius Petrosidius, the standard-bearer of the legion, found himself surrounded by great crowds of the enemy. He threw the eagle inside the rampart, and himself died, fighting most gallantly outside the camp. The others just managed to keep the enemy out until nightfall. In the night, since there was no hope left, every man of them committed suicide. A few soldiers had managed to slip away while the fighting was going on. By taking roundabout routes through the forests, they succeeded in reaching Labienus's camp and told him what had happened. The attack on Cicero's camp. Flushed with this success, Ambiorix at once set out with all his cavalry, and riding day and night came to the Aduatuci, a tribe living next to his kingdom. The infantry were ordered to follow. He explained what had been done and persuaded the Aduatuci to take up arms. Next day, he went on to the country of the Nervi and urged them not to let slip this excellent opportunity of winning freedom for themselves forever, and of making the Romans suffer for all the outrages they had committed. He informed them that 2 Roman generals had been killed, and the greater part of their army annihilated. It would not be difficult, he suggested, to make a sudden attack on the winter camp of Cicero, and to destroy the legion under his command also. And he offered his own assistance in carrying out this enterprise. The Nervi were easily persuaded to cooperate. Messengers were at once sent out to the dependent tribes of the Sutrones, the Grudi, the Levaci, the Glumoxi, and the Gaetuni. The largest possible forces were assembled, and with these they suddenly swooped down on Cicero's camp. Cicero had not yet heard of the death of Sabinus, and it happened to him too, as it was inevitable, that some of his troops, who had gone into the woods to get timber for the fortifications, were cut off by the sudden appearance of the enemy cavalry and surrounded. After this, a huge host of Eburones, Nervi, and Arduatuci, with all their allies and dependents, launched a direct attack on the camp. Our men quickly ran to arms and mounted the rampart. That day, they only just managed to hold out, for all the enemy's hopes lay in speed, and they were convinced that if they won the battle here, they would go on winning everywhere else. Cicero wrote to me at once and offered large rewards to anyone who could get through the enemy lines, but all the roads were blocked, and his messengers were intercepted. During the night, the men worked with incredible speed. Using the timber that had been brought in for the fortifications, they ran up about 120 towers and strengthened all apparent weaknesses in the defenses. Next day, the enemy appeared with much larger forces than before. They assaulted the camp and filled in the ditch, but our men put up the same resistance as on the previous day. And so it went, day after day. There was no breaking off work during the nights, no chance of sleep either for the sick or the wounded. Everything needed to meet the next day's attack had to be got ready during the hours of darkness. Quantities of stakes with their points hardened in the fire, and huge numbers of siege spikes were made. Extra stories were built on the towers, and battlements and breastworks of hurdles were fitted to them. Cicero himself was in very poor health, yet he would not take any rest, even during the night, until the men themselves came crowding around him and insisted that he must look after himself. Some of the chieftains and leaders of the Nervi had been on friendly terms with Cicero, and so had some excuse for approaching him. They now declared that they wished to parley. Their request granted, at this interview they adopted exactly the same line as that followed by Ambiorix when he spoke with Sabinus. The whole of Gaul, they said, was in arms. The Germans had crossed the Rhine. All Roman winter camps, including my own, were under assault. They then informed him of the death of Sabinus and produced Ambiorix as evidence for the truth of their story. "You are making a great mistake," they said, "if you think you are likely to get any help from the others, when the others are in desperate straits themselves. We ourselves, however, have nothing against Cicero or against Rome, except that we do not like this practice of quartering your armies on us for the winter, and we do not want this to become an established thing. So far as we are concerned, you are free to leave the camp in perfect safety and march in whatever direction you like without any fear at all." To all this, Cicero had only one reply to make. "Rome," he said, "does not make terms with an enemy who is still bearing arms. If you lay down your arms, I am prepared to give you facilities for sending a deputation to Caesar, and as Caesar is a just man, I trust that he will look favorably on your requests." Disappointed in this direction, the Nervi began to surround our camp with a rampart 9 feet high and a ditch 15 feet wide. They had learned how to do this by watching us in previous years and were given further instructions by prisoners from our army whom they had with them, though we did not know this. However, they had none of the proper tools for the work and had to do their best by cutting the sod with their swords, lifting out the earth with their bare hands, and carrying it away in their cloaks. With this in mind, one can get some idea of their numbers from the fact that in less than 3 hours they completed a line of earthworks 5 miles in circumference. And in the days following, still under the direction of Roman prisoners, they set to work on the construction of towers high enough to command our rampart, together with grappling irons and mantlets. On the 7th day of the siege, there was a high wind, and the enemy began slinging red-hot missiles molded from clay and hurling incendiary darts into the huts, which were thatched with straw after the Gallic fashion. The huts quickly caught fire, and the strong wind spread the flames all over the camp. At this, the enemy raised a great shout as though victory were not only in their grasp, but already won, and began to bring up their siege towers and mantlets and to scale the rampart with ladders. But our men showed a courage and a presence of mind that were quite remarkable. They were scorched by the fire burning all around them. They were under a constant hail of missiles, and they were aware that all their baggage and all their private possessions were ablaze. Yet not a single man left his post on the rampart, and scarcely one of them even looked over his shoulder. Every man of them at this moment of crisis fought with the utmost gallantry and the utmost resolution. It was much the toughest day's fighting of all, yet in the end the result was that on this day more of the enemy were killed and wounded than on any other, for the Gauls were crowded in a dense mass right underneath our rampart, and those in front had no chance of retiring because of the pressure on them from behind. In one sector, when the fire had died down a little, an enemy tower was brought forward so that it was actually touching the rampart, whereupon the centurions of the 3rd cohort withdrew from the position they were holding, ordered their men to fall back too, and then made signs and shouted invitations to the Gauls to come in if they liked. But none of them dared to come forward. They were dislodged by volleys of stones from all sides, and their tower was set on fire. In this legion there were 2 absolutely first-rate soldiers, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus, both centurions who were nearly qualified for the top rank of seniority. These 2 never stopped arguing about which of them was the better soldier, and every year when it came to the question of promotions, each one would try to outdo the other. Now, when the fighting round the rampart was at its fiercest, Pullo shouted out, "What are you waiting for, Vorenus? Do you want a better chance of showing how you can fight? Today will settle the argument between us." With these words he went forward beyond the fortifications and charged into the enemy at the point where their ranks were the thickest. Vorenus, of course, was not going to stay behind. He knew what people would think of him if he did, and so he went straight off to Pullo. When a little way from the enemy, Pullo hurled his javelin and transfixed one of the Gauls who had run forward to meet him. The Gaul was struck down unconscious, but his comrades covered him with their shields, while from all sides weapons rained down on Pullo so that he had no chance of retiring. One javelin went right through his shield and stuck in his sword belt. This twisted his scabbard out of position so that when he tried to draw his sword he could not at first seize the hilt. While he was struggling to do so, the enemy surrounded him. But now his rival Vorenus came up and got him out of his difficulties. Thinking that Pullo had been killed by the spear, the Gauls all turned away from him and immediately set upon Vorenus, who, fighting with his sword at close quarters, killed one man and was beginning to drive the others back. But in pressing forward too eagerly, he stumbled and fell into a depression in the ground. Now it was his turn to be surrounded, and the turn of Pullo to come up and rescue him. After killing a few more of the enemy, both centurions came back together safe and sound to the shelter of the fortifications. Each of them had deserved the highest possible praise, and in this bitter rivalry of theirs, fortune had produced a situation in which each of the 2 enemies had been the friend and savior of the other, so that it was quite impossible to decide which should be considered the better or the braver soldier. The difficulties and dangers of the siege were becoming greater every day, particularly because so many men were suffering from their wounds that only a few were left to carry on the defense. And as matters got worse, Cicero sent more and more messengers to me with dispatches. Some of these were captured and put to death by torture under the eyes of our troops. But there was a Nervian in the camp, a man of good family called Vertigo, who had deserted to Cicero at the very beginning of the siege and had served him loyally ever since. This man, by offering one of his slaves his freedom and great rewards as well, persuaded him to carry a dispatch to me. The slave tied the dispatch round his spear shaft, and being a Gaul himself, passed through the Gallic lines without arousing any suspicion. He went on until he came to me, and it was from him I heard of the danger that threatened Cicero and his legion. I received the dispatch in the early evening, and at once sent a messenger to the quaestor, Marcus Crassus, who was in camp about 24 miles away in the country of the Bellovaci, ordering him to start at midnight with his legion and join me as quickly as he could. Crassus left as soon as he received the message. I sent another messenger to Gaius Fabius, telling him to march with his legion into the country of the Atrebates, through which I knew I would have to go myself. I wrote to Labienus asking him to come with his legion to the Nervian frontier if he thought that he could do so without undue risk. The rest of the legions were too far away, and I thought it would be wrong to wait for them. But I collected about 400 cavalrymen from the nearest camps. About 9 o'clock on the following morning, I was informed by Crassus's patrols that he was approaching, and I set out myself. We covered about 20 miles that day. I left Crassus with his one legion in command at Amiens, where I had left all the heavy equipment of the army, the native hostages, all my official papers, and all the grain that had been collected to last for the winter. Fabius, who had made reasonable speed, joined me with his legion on the march, as he had been instructed to do. Labienus had heard of the death of Sabinus and the slaughter of his army, but he was now faced with a general mobilization of the Treveri. He was afraid that if he set out from his camp, it would look as though he were running away, and he might not be strong enough to beat off an enemy attack, especially as the enemy were now, he knew, in a most confident mood because of their recent victory. He therefore wrote to me to explain the dangers that would be involved in leading his legion out of camp. He also gave me a full account of what had happened in the country of the Eburones, and told me that the whole army of the Treveri, both horse and foot, had taken up a position about 3 miles away from his camp. I was now reduced to 2 legions instead of the 3 which